A cool wind swept in from Blackwater Bay, brushing salt into the air and funneling it through the crooked alleys of King's Landing. Dusk was falling slowly, warm hues of the sun resisting the night as if reluctant to leave the city's rooftops. Street lamps sputtered to life, flames dancing in iron cages, and in the spaces between the towers and turrets, clouds drifted with an uncanny grace. The season was supposed to be mild, a gentle autumn folding into winter soon enough. But the cold that prickled across the flesh of those still hustling in the streets felt sharper than the usual brisk turn of the weather. A few wondered if it was a storm on the horizon. Others guessed a trick of the wind. Most ignored it. They kept their heads bent low, going about their business in a city that never truly slept. No raven had arrived heralding any trouble, or if it had, few knew of it. This was the capital, after all. The Red Keep soared tall on Aegon's high hill, a monument to centuries of Targaryen rule, a labyrinth of secrets and power. In the cramped byways and cramped hearts of its inhabitants, a chill was hardly cause for alarm. Yet the watchmen standing on the walls of the city paused and exchanged uneasy looks as the final rays of the sun melted away. Something rustled in the wind, an odd whisper that almost carried words. They each listened for a heartbeat, but dismissed the notion. Sentries heard all sorts of strange echoes at night, especially if the wind was strong. One of them coughed and pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders. The other stared out toward the plains that stretched south, a brown expanse flecked with farms. Then he spat, said nothing, and returned to pacing the battlements. Beneath them, small pockets of noise continued. Merchants calling out to late buyers, bakers clearing out the last loaves, smiths dousing forge fires. Such sounds created the tapestry of the city's routine. The horizon lay calm. No torchlight from an army. No disturbance of crows. And so, the night watch continued without alarm. Within the Red Keep, a banquet of sorts was being held, though it was by no means a grand affair. King Tommen sat the Iron Throne in name, but in practice, power was distributed among his advisors, the lords of the realm who vied to influence the boy king, each with their own agenda. On this evening, however, the court was quiet. A modest dinner, more a reminder of civility than a celebration. Servants moved politely between the tables, refilling goblets of watered wine, placing simple fare of roasted fowl and boiled vegetables. A handful of high lords engaged in half-hearted conversation. Cersei Lannister, seated near Tommen, wore a thoughtful look, though her eyes glimmered with the constant vigilance of a mother who had learned to keep her emotions in check. She had heard rumors of unearthly cold in the north, rumors that came down with each caravan or messenger. Whispers of wildling sightings that had grown bolder, talk of undead in the far reaches of the kingdom. She dismissed most of it, her mind refusing to accept that such stories could ever pierce the heart of the capital. Yet a part of her, the more primal part that believed in portents and old wives' tales, felt uneasy. She told no one. Jaime Lannister, though not seated at the feast in full comfort, due to his severed hand and the scorn of some who once revered him, did his best to maintain a relaxed poise. He was exchanging low words with Bronn, who had made a small fortune and earned small favor at the Lannister side. They discussed matters of security, how the gates were manned, how many men could be relied upon if a threat emerged. Threats always lurked, with or without the chill. But even Jaime felt it that night, a curious sensation like a ghostly touch on the back of his neck. He sipped wine and tried to ignore it, turning his thoughts to memories of better days. Outside in the courtyard, torches flickered fitfully as if teased by a bitter wind. Across the city, in Flea Bottom, the poorest denizens huddled around scrapwood fires. The chill had come on unseasonably strong. Rats scurried along the gutters, while cats prowled the edges of gloom, occasionally mewling in complaint. There was a tension in the air that beggared explanation. A sellsword on the run from Bravos sat in a corner tavern, nursing a chipped cup of ale. His bones ached with a foreboding that he attributed to his old wounds and the dampness in the air. A group of children, none older than 10, rummaged through refuse, their movements stiff from the cold. They too felt it, something deeper than just the drop in temperature. But it had no name, so they thought little of it. Unbeknownst to them, In the shadows beyond the city's gaze, something stirred that had not stirred in centuries. Far out in the distance, no horns were sounded to give them warning. By the time full darkness arrived, the wind coming off Blackwater Bay grew louder. It was no storm in the typical sense. There were no thunderheads, no lightning, just a creeping cold that spread across the water and over the walls. The narrow sea had no ice drifting upon it, at least not this far south, but the brine was sapped of its usual smell of fish and seaweed, replaced by an acrid tang that sailors would have found unfamiliar. At the mud gate, a pair of city watchmen yawned their way through their shift, breath rising in small wisps of fog. One turned his head, squinting out across the blackness where the bay was barely visible except for a faint reflection of moonlight. He thought he saw something there, far off. But the vision was too fleeting to be sure. Possibly a distant fisher's lantern or a vessel crossing the water. But the bay was uncommonly still. The watchman scratched at his stubbled cheek and tried to shake the chill from his bones. Inside the keep, courtiers finished their subdued feast. Tommen was escorted to his chambers by the King's Guard. Cersei excused herself with a polite nod, leaving behind scraps of conversation she deemed fruitless. Lords took their leave in ones and twos, returning to their separate rooms. Servants cleared the table, quietly singing to themselves, or thinking of bed. The corridors of the Red Keep, lined with austere tapestries and flickering sconces, felt unusually cold to the staff. More than one looked over their shoulder, spooked by the long, moon-cast shadows that stretched upon the walls. They'd hurry along, eager to deposit dirty plates and goblets in the kitchens before retreating to their bunks. To those who knew the keep intimately, it was clear that something was off, though none could say exactly what. It was as if an invisible presence had slithered inside, lingering in corners and unoccupied chambers. In the royal apartments, Tommen drifted to a fitful sleep. The boy king's dreams were plagued by half-formed visions. A giant city ablaze, shadows that walked in the shape of men, the keening of some unnatural wind that turned the skies gray and bleak. He tossed and turned, mewling softly like a frightened child. Ser Boros, posted outside his door, heard nothing through the thick wood. Another guard wandered by on the nightly rounds, and they exchanged idle talk about the chill. But soon the conversation died. The guard continued on, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, swallowed by silence and the hush of old stones. Elsewhere in the city, in a cramped set of rooms near the top of a ramshackle brothel, a young courtesan sat on a windowsill and peered out into the gloom. She had a vantage of the rooftops and glimpsed moonlit wisps of cloud drifting overhead. She felt disquieted, though not by anything in the room. Something about the night made her skin prickle, and she closed the shutters with a shiver. On the streets below, a raven landed on a gutter spout, cawing once before fluttering off into the night. The city was settling into slumber. Even the muffled chaos of Flea Bottom was easing into dark quiet. A handful of taverns rang with late-night laughter, and a couple of shadowy exchanges still took place in hidden corners. Thieves concluding a deal, smugglers ferrying contraband. All the while, the cold spread. By midnight, frost crept over the city's outer stones, a delicate lace of ice forming where dew had settled. Guards on the ramparts stomped their feet, complaining in hushed tones. This cold was unnatural, they said, for no season in King's Landing turned so bitter so quickly. Whispers drifted between them of dark magic, of northern curses. One old guard told a tale of white walkers, how they were rumored to bring an endless winter. The others laughed it off, but their laughter was forced. One pointed out that white walkers were myths of the far north, a land away from the Red Keep's domain. The old guard shrugged, uneasy. A hush fell among them again, each man content to retreat into his own thoughts. And so, they continued their duty, ignorant that just beyond their sight, shapes moved closer, cloaked in the blackness of the night. Somewhere after the hour of the owl's hoot, torches in the city streets had burned low or gone out entirely. The moon was high, and the stars shimmered with a clarity that felt odd for a city so used to haze. Everything was too still. Even the water in the bay seemed motionless, as if seized by an invisible frost. The last of the fishermen had long since docked, their sails limp in the fleeting breeze, and not a single gull called. In a small watchtower near the harbor, A solitary guard named Pat stared out at the bay's emptiness. He thought he saw a faint shimmer, far, far out at sea, but he could not place it. His heart thumped in his chest, though he did not know why. His breath, visible in the cold air, coiled into a ghostly shape. Suddenly he heard a sound like ice cracking. He glanced around, trying to discern its source, but no culprit met his eyes. With a swallow of nerves, he stayed at his post. He was a loyal guard, after all, no matter how uneasy the night made him feel. Back in the Red Keep, in a hidden corridor where light rarely touched, a hooded figure walked with caution. Varys had his ways of moving unseen, though many of his little birds had scattered or been repurposed. Still, the Master of Whisperers, if indeed he still claimed that title, possessed a keen sense for disruptions in the balance of power. He glided through the darkness, pausing at intervals, as if listening to the walls themselves. His lips were parted in a silent breath, and his eyes flickered with concern. Rumors from the north had reached him days ago. Word of a threat older than the Targaryen conquest, older than the Wall. His sources were uncertain, their accounts contradictory, but all pointed to one chilling consensus. These so-called White Walkers were not content to stay in the distant snows. They were moving south. Varys had doubted they could come this far so soon. And yet, the air in the Red Keep felt different. Something was amiss. He pressed on, searching for confirmation in the hidden corners that he called home. Well past the midnight hour, the city itself seemed trapped in a moment of waiting. Lamps flickered or died. A dog barked once, then fell silent. A chill wind roamed the streets and courtyards, the shuttered stalls and locked manors. And in that hush, the first watchers on the city walls thought they saw silhouettes along the horizon, an eerie line of figures too far to be sure. The watchers rubbed their eyes, certain it must be a trick of the moonlight. Yet when they looked again, the shapes seemed closer. A few gave alarm. The horns had not been sounded in an age, but one guard, rattled by fear, climbed to the bell tower and began to ring a dull peal that resounded over the rooftops. The noise woke sleepers and startled drunks. Light after light began to blink on in windows across the city. Whispers rose to a confused murmur. In the Red Keep, courtiers who had settled into their chambers sprang upright, hearts pounding. The king's guard was mustered. Lannister soldiers snapped to attention, if only half-dressed for battle. Cersei, roused from a restless sleep, demanded to know what was happening. Jaime too hurried to gather men, though many looked at each other bewildered. It was not an army from Dorne or from the Reach. There had been no talk of open war at King's Landing's doorstep. So who or what was out there? The city watch scrambled. The gold cloaks, unaccustomed to such an abrupt alarm. They spilled out into the streets, spears and swords at the ready, confusion playing on their faces. Few had faced any real threat in the capital beyond riots or criminal scuffles. Men with eyes wide behind their helmets made their way to the gates, to the walls, to vantage points along the coastline. As the city stirred in panic, more and more swore they saw those silhouettes. Lanky, inhuman shapes, faintly outlined by the moonlight, perched in the distance. A ragged hush fell upon the watchers. There was something dreadful about those forms, something that prickled at the primal corners of the mind. Fear latched onto them, gnawing with an intensity that few had ever felt. Cersei, draped in a hastily thrown-on gown, took to a balcony in the Red Keep that overlooked the city. She could see torches and lamps forming a sea of flickering lights, the streets whirling with confusion. She heard the distant clatter of arms. Her jaw tightened. She hated not knowing what enemy had come to knock upon her door. A group of advisors clamored around her, each spouting different theories. A raiding party, some magical hoax, a band of rebels. Their voices overlapped until she silenced them with a hiss. Jaime arrived at her side, wearing partial armor, the best he could do with a single hand in such haste, and leaning more heavily on his old friend Bronn for assistance. The three exchanged a taut look. Jaime's eyes were grim. He said nothing, but the set of his mouth spoke volumes. Cersei's grip on the balustrade whitened her knuckles. Then came the sound, low at first, like the final exhalation of a dying beast. It slid through the city's air, a resonant moan that seemed to freeze the hearts of all who heard it. Soldiers paused mid-step. Citizens crouched in doorways. The hair on the backs of necks stood up across King's Landing. The sound did not end in a single note, but instead rose in a harrowing crescendo, a wail that no living throat could produce. It seemed to echo from the walls themselves, crawling down alleyways, bleeding through shuttered windows. Some men clapped hands to their ears. Others dropped to their knees. Cersei stared toward the horizon, her eyes wide. It felt as though winter's final screech had manifested in a single, terrifying voice. In the fields just beyond the city's outer farmland, shapes began to move. The White Walkers, or others, as the old tales called them, stepped into the faint glow cast by torches on the wall. At first glance, a watcher might take them for slender men dressed in pale rags. But as the flickering flames caught their figures, the watchers saw the awful truth. Their flesh was as pale as snow, their limbs unnaturally elongated, their eyes a deep, glacial blue that glowed in the dark. Each carried a weapon seemingly forged of ice, shimmering eerily under the moonlight. Where they stepped, frost crackled, radiating outward in fractal patterns on the grass and soil. Behind them, an army of whites shuffled. The reanimated dead, men and women, and perhaps even creatures from corners unknown, flesh sagging and bones visible, eyes vacant yet hungry for living warmth. The sight of them made the watchers retch and recoil. Hundreds upon hundreds advanced, filling the field as if drawn by the very heartbeats of those inside the walls. At the ramparts, men shouted, "We're under attack!" The city's bells tolled louder, frantic. Arrows were notched, though many hands trembled. Archers prayed under their breath, cursing the gods for abandoning them to this nightmare. The White Walkers paused just out of arrow range, their glowing eyes surveying the city. It was as though they were savoring the moment. Some watchers claimed they heard the others' laughter. High and brittle, like cracking ice, the whites milled restlessly behind them, a murmuring mass of death. Then, a single walker, taller than the rest, raised its icy blade and pointed at King's Landing's walls. Chaos erupted. Arrows flew, arcs of flame from the braziers on the ramparts shooting across the dark sky. Some found purchase in the whites, bodies that lit up with dull, slow-burning flames. Yet for each white felled, 3 more trudged forward. A volley of arrows clattered against the White Walkers, but their unnatural grace and that strange armor of cold protected them. Shards of frosty air seemed to swirl in front of their bodies, turning aside shafts of wood and steel as though it were child's play. A few city watchmen cursed in terror, stepping back from the crenellations. Others tried to hold firm, their captain bellowing for them to stand strong. But how does one stand strong against a legend come to life? A living embodiment of winter's wrath. Panic permeated the city. Women and children roused from slumber, huddled in corners. Some rushed to find the sept, as though the Seven might save them, if only they prayed loudly enough. In the Red Keep's courtyard, Lannister soldiers rallied, forming ranks. Some had witnessed the capabilities of these creatures in whispered accounts from travelers. Others had never even heard of them before. Word spread that dragon steel or dragon glass was needed to kill them, but King's Landing had precious little dragon glass. The Targaryens once had stores of it from Dragonstone, but most was lost or unused. A few might remain in the old storerooms, though no one knew for certain, and time was short. Jaime Lannister addressed a small group of knights, his eyes set with determination. "We hold the walls," he said. "Whatever they are, they don't get inside." His voice wavered once, betraying the shock he felt at the sight of the monstrous ranks beyond. Still, he forced himself to maintain composure. He had seen horror during war, and though this was unlike anything in his memory, his duty was to defend the city. Bronn gripped his sword anxiously, giving Jaime a quick nod. Nearby, Sir Lancel Lannister, still bearing scars from prior battles, looked pale. Jaime placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "Summon what courage you can," Jaime said. "We stand or we fall, but we do it together." Lancel swallowed hard, nodded. Meanwhile, the White Walkers moved closer. They advanced methodically, a line of tall, pale shapes, leading the slow avalanche of whites behind them. Where they passed, the ground froze, grass turning brittle white, snapping underfoot. The air was so cold that watchers exhaled clouds of steam, even from yards away. An archer took aim, releasing a fire-tipped arrow that sizzled as it landed near a walker's feet. The ice guard parted like a living swirl, and the walkers strode on unscathed. Those men with the metal to hold position hurled insults, curses, and more arrows in a futile attempt to ward off the advance. Each moment, the monstrous army crept nearer, their undead eyes gleaming in the darkness. On a higher wall, Qyburn stood watching, lips parted in a silent, fascinated horror. He had read old manuscripts, considered supernatural phenomena in the pursuit of knowledge, but to see these creatures, an entire legion of them, was something else entirely. He thought of all the hidden texts, the half-forgotten spells and necromancies in ancient tomes. Part of him quivered at the knowledge that every soul in the city was at stake. Another part was quietly intrigued, pondering how the whites were reanimated, how the White Walkers channeled such fearsome cold. He couldn't help the sliver of dark curiosity that wormed through him. But that curiosity paled in the face of the immediate threat. He glanced down, noting the city's disorganized attempts at mustering a defense. He hurried off to see if any meager store of dragonfire or wildfire might be used. Wildfire had destroyed Stannis' fleet and nearly consumed the city once before. But perhaps tonight, that terrible green flame could serve as salvation, if used wisely, or if the Queen would allow it. The first wave of whites reached the gates. With a collective moan, they clawed at the wood, scraping and pounding. City watchmen and soldiers above poured boiling oil, flung torches, shot arrows. They watched, horrified, as many of the whites ignited but kept moving, their dead limbs unaffected by pain. The stench of burning flesh filled the air. Some whites collapsed, but more scrambled over them, forming a hideous mound. At intervals, one of the White Walkers would raise an icy weapon, and a localized blast of cold would extinguish the flames or freeze the oil. It was as though they were unraveling every conventional means of defense. Screams rose from the walls as some defenders turned to flee, only to be shoved back into line by their captains. The clang of steel and the hiss of fire melded with the inhuman wails echoing from beyond the gate. Men felt their hearts racing, their instincts screaming to run. In the upper halls of the Red Keep, Tommen was roused once more by the pandemonium. He was frightened as any boy would be, but he tried to be brave, to be a king. Cersei stayed close, though for once she had no soothing words. When she looked at her son, her eyes betrayed a flicker of real fear. As the night deepened, shadows flickered across the walls, and every so often, that dreadful, keening wail reverberated. Servants scrambled to relocate valuables, stashing them deeper in the keep. Refugees from the lower city began arriving at the gates of the Red Keep, pounding and begging for admittance. The gold cloaks let a trickle in, but soon had to bar the doors to prevent a stampede. Mothers wailed, children cried, men cursed the fates. Somewhere in that maelstrom, a rumor spread that the dead were unstoppable, that the city was doomed. The rumor gathered steam like a storm cloud, sowing panic through the throngs. Cersei and Jaime conferred in a corridor lined with tall windows. Outside, the flames of battle danced upon the curtain wall. She demanded to know how the enemy had come so far south without warning, how the North had failed to send ravens. Jaime only shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "Something must have happened. Perhaps the wall fell, or..." He trailed off, mindful of how insane such words sounded. Cersei gritted her teeth. "If the wall fell," she hissed, "then all the North is lost. The Seven help us." It was strange to hear her invoke the gods that she so often scorned, but desperation made for odd bedfellows. Jaime placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, but even that gesture held little solace. The White Walkers at the gates were a threat beyond their understanding. Even if the entire Lannister army had been present, it might not have sufficed against this supernatural horde. Far below, the gate was starting to give. Heavy timbers groaned under the relentless assault. The city's defenders struggled to brace it, piling crates and rubble. But it was only a temporary measure. The White Walkers moved among the whites, methodically hacking at weak points in the gates with their ice blades. Here and there, a soldier mustered enough courage to pour flaming pitch directly onto a walker's pale form. The flames licked at the creature's body, but it snarled, eyes flaring blue, and the fire was extinguished in a swirl of frost. It stabbed upward, sending shards of ice through the gate's murder hole, impaling men above. Screams of pain followed as blood dripped onto the throng of whites, who hissed with unholy appetite. The defenders recognized their own mortal fragility. Then, a new sound joined the cacophony. A dull, green roar. From the ramparts on the eastern side of the city, a barrel of wildfire was tipped, and a cascade of brilliant emerald flame erupted, washing over the ranks of whites. In a flash, dozens of undead shriveled and collapsed into ashen husks. The defenders cheered, hearts surging with hope. A White Walker near the explosion reeled back, hissing in a language of cracking ice, seemingly injured by the ferocity of the green flame. Another barrel was lit, rolled over the side, and erupted in a second wave of blazing green death. For a moment, it seemed the tide might be turned, but the victory was short-lived. The White Walkers grouped together, raising their weapons in unison. A swirl of bitter wind coalesced around them, forming a vortex that sucked the oxygen from the air, stifling the wildfire. Its once unstoppable burn faltered and died, leaving only a few lingering patches of flickering green. The watchers on the wall felt despair sink into their bones again. Even wildfire, that fearsome weapon, seemed no match for this. Still, they resolved to keep trying. Better to die with some semblance of resistance than surrender to the ice and the dark. Below in the Red Keep, Qyburn directed servants to bring more wildfire from the stores, cautioning them about its volatility. The barrels were heavy and unstable, and even a slight jostle could set them off. Yet they were the best chance at halting the mass of undead. In the throne room, the Iron Throne itself stood eerily in the flickering torchlight, as though mocking those who sought to rule over chaos. Some lords cowered, their confidence in politics and plots shattered by this stark confrontation with ancient evil. Others raged or prayed. Sir Meryn Trant, Sir Boros Blount, and the other King's Guard stood poised by Tommen, uncertain of what to do beyond defending the boy king's life. The entire city teetered on the brink, and dawn was still hours away. On the walls near the gate, a stocky city watch officer named Ragan found a measure of courage in the knowledge that his family was behind those walls. He organized a desperate plan to drop large stones, heavy debris, and anything that could be hurled down at the swarm below. The defenders set to work, straining to hoist cartwheels, broken columns, even the bodies of the newly fallen. All was fair in a desperate bid to keep the dead at bay. The assault rained down, crushing whites and forcing them temporarily back from the gate. But the White Walkers pressed on, impervious to fear or exhaustion. The gate's timbers shuddered with each blow. A hairline crack formed in the wood, splitting from hinge to hinge. Cersei stood at a window, witnessing the horror of it all. Her face was pale, but composed. She glanced at Jaime and whispered, "If the city falls, if they breach the walls." She stopped, throat closing over the dreadful thought. Memories of wildfire exploding through the streets during the siege of Stannis battered her mind. This was worse. A part of her considered the unthinkable. To scorch the entire city if it meant denying the undead a foothold. Her lips parted, but Jaime recognized that look, the same desperation that had once led Aerys Targaryen to plan burning the city. He shook his head sternly, placing a staying hand on her wrist. "Not yet," he said. "We fight. We hold." For once, his eyes held a fierce resolve that mirrored duty, not cunning. She pursed her lips, momentarily yielding. Below them, men continued to die. The walls slick with blood that froze in the night air. Piles of dead whites started to form, blocking other whites behind them. But the White Walkers cleverly cut through the carnage, forging paths for their ranks of undead to shuffle forward. The defenders' morale hung by a thread. Over and over, the bell tolled, a harsh clang that set hearts racing. Flames flickered, then were smothered by cold blasts. Arrows found little purchase. The endless moan of the undead reverberated through the city's bones. In dim corners of the capital, faith faltered. People huddled in fear, eyes squeezed shut against the nightmares that had become reality. A second gate, to the north side of the city, shuddered as the undead spread around the perimeter. It was guarded by fewer men, and soon the pounding of whites against wood began anew, echoing in the night. Calls for reinforcements were shouted from one tower to another, but the city's defenders were stretched thin. The handful of knights and watchmen who had manned that gate prepared for the worst. Some hunkered down behind barricades, swords trembling in their hands. Others prayed or wept quietly, uncertain if the dawn would ever come. High in Maegor's holdfast, Tommen tried to be a king. He asked in his trembling voice how he might help, but those around him insisted he stay safe. They told him that moral support was enough. He stood stiffly, eyes darting from face to face. He wanted to be braver, to save his people somehow. But how does a boy stand against the embodiment of ice and death? Cersei, noticing his resolve, placed a hand on his shoulder, fiercely maternal. Her mind churned for a solution. Any solution. She had once pinned her hopes on alliances, on cunning, on raw might. But cunning did little when the enemy was a legion of monsters that did not fear gold or threats. Might was ephemeral, especially with so few loyal banners in the city. Even the hidden reserves of Wildfire seemed feeble next to the White Walkers' chilling power. The night wore on. The gate splintered bit by bit. Everywhere in King's Landing, hearts pounded. Candle flames flickered in the gloom, illuminating frightened faces. A raw, unwavering terror settled over the capital, an aura that seeped into every corner. The White Walkers advanced not in haste, but with cruel patience, like winter that envelops the land, unstoppable and implacable. The howling wind that accompanied them rattled shutters and set teeth chattering. The first break came at last when a section of the main gate shattered under the weight of the undead. With a thunderous crack, a chunk of timber collapsed inward, allowing a press of whites to surge through. They poured in a wave of decomposing horror, eyes vacant and hungering. The defenders cried out, unleashing a desperate flurry of sword swings, spear thrusts, and arrows. Some whites fell, but more replaced them, pushing the front lines forward with unrelenting force. The White Walkers followed calmly, stepping over the broken threshold as though entering a banquet hall. Their glowing blue eyes settled upon the city with a predatory hunger, a desire to blanket it in eternal night. Yet even then, the defenders did not simply roll over. One squad of Lannister men, led by a knight named Sir Brennart, rallied near the breach with a stout wall of shields. They jabbed their swords into the whites, hacking limbs and heads in a savage melee that sent putrid gore splattering. Rivulets of old blood and black ichor froze the moment it hit the cold air. A white's jaws snapped at Sir Brennart, but he bashed it aside with his shield, grunting as he drove his sword into its skull. Another white latched onto a soldier's arm, biting through cloth and sinew, forcing a scream that echoed. The Gold Cloak captain howled for retreat, but there was no easy retreat to be had. They were pinned against their own city streets, the undead pouring in. The White Walkers watched as the defenders were forced to give ground, step by bloody step. Top the walls, archers fired at will, picking off the whites that threatened to overwhelm the shield line. Soldiers scrambled to form new defensive positions in the twisting streets. Barricades went up at major intersections, behind which terrified men aimed crossbows. The plan was to channel the undead into kill zones, but with each passing moment, the White Walkers' presence seemed to intensify the cold, making it harder to move, to grip weapons, to draw breath. Frost filmed over cobblestones, and men slipped or lost feeling in their fingers. Even the horses in the stables whinnied in distress, eyes rolling, as the cold seeped into their bones. Wildfire barrels were being readied at strategic points. Qyburn oversaw the distribution of the volatile substance, his face grave. If a White Walker was near, they might again quell the flames, but Qyburn hoped that setting off multiple barrels at once could create a wave of fire they could not stop. He had no illusions that such a plan might kill innocents as well. But with the city's survival on the line, he steeled himself for the grim necessity. Cersei, standing behind the walls of the keep, demanded updates from every messenger that ran her way. All bore grim tidings. The Whites were inside the city, certain enclaves were holding them off for the moment, but fear was spreading like plague. Jaime rejoined her briefly, face streaked with soot and sweat. A new cut on his cheek from some close call. "They've breached," he confirmed, breath ragged. "We're trying to hold them at the first line of streets, but we can't stop them all." He didn't mention that the White Walkers themselves barely seemed touched by the fighting. Lannister troops had flung themselves in vain attempts to harm them. Even well-forged steel shattered on those icy blades. The Watchers had tried to aim for the creatures with scorpion bolts normally used against siege towers, but the White Walkers moved with an otherworldly agility. Some had only glimpsed them flickering in and out of shadows, as if they walked on a ghostly wind. Cersei's eyes flashed. She gripped Jaime's good hand. "We cannot let them take the Red Keep," she hissed, her voice trembling. "We must make a stand." Her words were fervent, as though she could will victory into existence. Jaime could only nod. He was a knight, sworn to protect. But faced with these beings, he felt like an ant under a boot. Still, he would not abandon the fight. Beyond the keep, in the labyrinth of King's Landing streets, the first pockets of civilians trying to flee ran headlong into the undead. Panicked screams rose up. Men and women were pulled down by the Whites, torn apart, or overwhelmed by sheer numbers. In some areas, children cried out for parents who had become separated in the chaos. Torches burned faintly, illuminating scenes of carnage that would haunt the nightmares of any who survived. But the living fought back as best they could, brandishing knives, clubs, whatever they had. For every cluster of terrified peasants who cowered, there was at least one group that tried to mount some form of defense, however hopeless. Desperate times revealed desperate courage. Amid this madness, the White Walkers strode onward with a terrible calm. Their swords, long and crystalline, sliced through steel and flesh as though it were parchment. Frost trailed their footsteps. Where a living warrior fell, a White was born soon after, rising with that same vacant stare, body twisted by death's grip. The city began to drown in roving pockets of the undead. Only the fierce determination of the defenders in certain choke points prevented a total collapse. The stench of death mingled with the bitter tang of ice in the cold air. And above it all, the moon hung, a silent witness to the city's torment. Though dawn was still hours away, some men prayed fervently that the sunrise would bring reprieve from these creatures of night and cold. Stories told that the others hated sunlight, but as the intangible gloom pressed down upon King's Landing, some wondered if daybreak would truly banish the horror. A line of archers stationed on a rooftop continued to release fire arrows into the mass of Whites below, with minimal effect. They lit the undead, yet the White Walkers quickly conjured cold blasts that snuffed out the flames. It was a maddening tug of war, with no real progress being made by the defenders. A desperate messenger reached the Red Keep, breathless, telling Cersei and Jaime that the southwestern gate might soon fall as well. The Watchers there were lacking in numbers, and had only minimal supplies of oil or fire arrows. Jaime recognized the name of the watch captain there. Sir Dunstan, a loyal if uninspired man, probably out of his depth. Jaime cursed under his breath. He turned to Cersei. "I must reinforce them," he said. "If they breach from the southwest, we'll be surrounded." Cersei nodded, though her eyes shone with fear. Jaime snatched up his sword, stifling the trembling in his hand. As he turned to leave, she called his name. He glanced back, and the look she gave him was raw, a moment of vulnerability. He gave a short nod, then ran off, heading for the southwestern battlements with a cadre of soldiers at his heels. As the night stretched on, the city convulsed with violence. White fog hissed from the mouths of the undead, tangling with the steam of the living's breath. The clang of steel and the crackle of brittle bones filled the air. Every so often, a chunk of green flame exploded and a cheer went up. But that cheer always died away, replaced by a deeper despair when the undead pressed forward again. The White Walkers, regal in their monstrous bearing, orchestrated the siege with silent efficiency. Somewhere near the Street of Flower, an old man huddled with his granddaughter behind a stack of grain sacks. They listened to the scrapes and moans of the Whites searching nearby houses. The child wanted to scream, But the old man clamped a hand over her mouth, tears in his eyes. He had lived through the sack of King's Landing by the Baratheon forces all those years ago. But never had he seen such horror. He prayed to the Seven that dawn would come, that the creatures might vanish like a foul dream. But the night seemed endless, and each passing second magnified his hopelessness. Cersei paced the grand hall of the Red Keep, her footsteps echoing. Courtiers cowered in corners or tried to offer advice. Several high-born lords demanded safe passage out of the city, but where would they go? The gates were blocked by an army of the dead. Some insisted that the king should flee by ship, though there was no guarantee the harbor remained safe. The queen snapped that they were all fools if they thought the White Walkers would spare ships at anchor. She was as trapped as anyone. Her cunning mind spun with possible stratagems, but each one was undone by the other's unstoppable nature. She refused to believe that all was lost. She could still hear the distant screams from the lower wards, and that galvanized her anger as much as her fear. In the corridors below the keep, flickering torches illuminated Qyburne's path as he personally oversaw the movement of the wildfire. The containers were carried with shaking hands by servants and lesser alchemists, each well aware that a single drop of the substance could set them all aflame. They moved slowly, placing barrels in strategic points near the Red Keep's entrances, along key staircases and kill zones. The plan was to create a final ring of fire if the undead forced their way inside. Qyburne's face was a mask of grim concentration. He had no illusions that many would die in such a conflagration, but it might save a portion of the keep, or at least deny the White Walkers total victory. Outside, in a city courtyard near the Dragon Pit, a group of brave defenders made a stand. They had blockaded the archway leading to the pit, hoping to use the ancient stone structure as a fallback. Fallen wights littered the ground in front of their barricade, but more kept coming. Those defenders had one advantage. A few barrels of lamp oil they had managed to roll out. Lighting rag-wrapped arrows from a brazier, they launched them at the wights. The resulting fire spread in a wave of scorching heat. For an instant, the courtyard was lit up like daylight, revealing the twisted faces of the undead. Some wights collapsed, heads still aflame. The defenders cheered, but the White Walkers in the distance raised their arms, summoning a wind that howled across the courtyard. In the space of a breath, the flames lost their fury, snuffed out like candles in a tempest. The defenders' cheers turned to shouts of dismay. The wights surged forward again, unrelenting. Steel clashed, men roared in defiance. But one by one the defenders were dragged down, their cries lost in the swirling darkness. All throughout the night, such battles played out in pockets across King's Landing. Walls were scaled or crumbled, windows were smashed, doors were battered down. The city's labyrinthine structure created some confusion for the undead, slowing their progress. But for each path that was blocked, the White Walkers found another route, often smashing through walls or leading the wights through sewer grates. The living took small solace in each moment of resilience, but with each passing hour, the dead's foothold grew like a creeping frost that would soon engulf everything in its path. And still the bells tolled, ringing out across the capital in a solemn dirge that seemed to herald the city's last hours. Cersei could hear them echoing off the stony walls as she stood at a higher window, her mind racing. Another messenger stumbled up the steps, face ashen, to report that wights had been seen in the royal stables, that men were turning on each other in the madness. She felt rage twist her features. "We'll kill them," she said, though she hardly knew how. "We'll burn them all if we must." Her green eyes gleamed with fanatical light. That old Targaryen madness she had once accused others of seemed ready to claim her. She did not want to lose everything. Not again. Outside, the cold pressed deeper into the city's marrow. The White Walkers continued their advance. The living reeled from each wave of wights. The scent of decay, of ash, and of cold fire swirled on the wind. A hush, deep and terrible, fell across the battered gate, punctuated only by the distant ring of steel and the moan of the undead. The city stood on the brink, teetering between life and the icy jaws of a winter that knew no mercy. And the night stretched on, cruel and unending, offering no promise that dawn would come soon enough to save them. "Ah, Kai," Torches across King's Landing sputtered and died, their flames bowing to the unearthly chill that pressed in from all sides. Overhead, clouds churned like a cauldron of black ink, stealing what little moonlight remained. The city's bells pealed in a relentless, forlorn chorus, a clarion call that warned of inevitable doom. Snow, or something akin to it, drifted in swirling eddies, though the flakes were sparse and hard as shards of glass. The White Walkers advanced steadily through crooked streets, each silent step marking a deeper incursion into the capital. Their icy footfalls crushed cobblestone, leaving imprints of hoarfrost that glinted in the scattered torchlight. Behind them, Whites lumbered by the dozens, moaning and clacking skeletal jaws, a dark parody of men. Near the remnants of the main gate, a wide courtyard had become a battleground, lit by only a few remaining braziers and the pale glow of distant fires. The massive arch was split, half the wood caved inward, allowing a constant flow of the dead. Lannister soldiers, City Watch, and what few able-bodied volunteers were brave enough to stand, stood in makeshift lines. Their faces shone with sweat and fear, though each recognized there was nowhere left to run. Swords hacked at putrid limbs, while spears thrust forward in frantic arcs. The shrieks of the wounded rose above the din, harsh and unending. At the center of this maelstrom, a broad-shouldered man with a salt and pepper beard roared at his comrades to stand firm. His name was Harbert, a once retired captain of the City Watch, who had rejoined the Gold Cloaks to serve the realm in its time of need. Clad in battered plate, he directed his men to target the Whites' legs and arms, to hack them down even if they could not be killed by ordinary steel. "Knock them apart and move on," he shouted, voice cracking. "They'll not tire, so we mustn't either." Many around him heard, though few had the strength to keep going without faltering. Every block or slash took a toll on their stamina. Still, Harbert's voice offered them a small anchor in the tempest of horror. A few steps away, a cluster of Whites managed to scramble over piles of their own fallen. Their skeletal fingers clawed at shields, pried them loose, and latched onto flesh. A half-dozen defenders toppled, lost in the writhing heap. The survivors shouted in dismay, lunging forward to try to pull them free. One White's jaw closed over a man's throat. The unfortunate soldier gurgled in agony, his lifeblood spurting in dark streaks. Harbert forced himself not to recoil, keeping his sword arm moving. He brought his blade down on the White skull, splitting it in two. That husk collapsed, but another undead figure rose to take its place, eyes glazed white and jaws snapping. There was no end to them, no respite. Above, perched on a jagged portion of the broken gate, stood a White Walker, tall and statuesque. Its armor seemed woven of frost and moonlight, glinting with an otherworldly sheen. In its grasp lay an ice-forged spear, a thing that shimmered as if alive with fractals of crystal. Without visible emotion, it surveyed the battle below, head tilting in faint curiosity. Then, with balletic grace, it leapt down into the courtyard. The defenders near it scrambled backward in alarm. Men had traded hushed stories about White Walkers, or the others, but few had seen them up close and survived. The creature's eyes glowed with a baleful blue light, piercing the gloom. One of the soldiers, trembling, tried to bring down a spiked mace on it. The walker evaded with ease, gliding aside in a swirl of cold air. It leveled its spear, thrust once, and the soldier's armor froze, cracking apart like thin glass. The man let out a strangled scream as his flesh turned white and brittle. Another blow shattered him into red and white shards that tinkled on the ground. Harbert watched, heart pounding. He ordered archers to shoot, but the White Walker drifted behind a knot of Whites who soaked the incoming arrows with uncaring flesh. When it emerged again, it was upon the flank of Harbert's men, weaving among them in a dance of lethal precision. Every stroke of its spear spelled death, and each corpse it left behind began its own horrible transformation. No matter how fiercely the defenders struck, they could not touch it with ordinary steel. Harbert roared in frustration, half blind from the stinging cold in his eyes. Something primal in his mind told him to flee, to run from this unstoppable presence. But there was no place left to go. Elsewhere in the city, narrower streets suffered their own brand of chaos. crammed with panicked folk trying to reach the Red Keep's gates. They had become funnels for the undead. Packs of wights roamed, drawn by the heat of terrified bodies. Screams echoed against the tall tenements and half-finished structures. Some of the poor souls tried to hide in cellars, others in attics. Wherever they went, the biting cold pursued them. In one cramped alley, the bodies of half a dozen butchers' apprentices lay strewn about, gore staining the cobblestones. The wights that had killed them lurched toward a storehouse where more refugees cowered. Doors broke easily under the combined strength of multiple undead arms. Not far from that scene, a handful of men and women from Flea Bottom resisted with a ferocity born of desperation. Armed with knives, cleavers, and crude clubs, they barricaded an intersection where the shops were built so close that a single well-placed wagon served to block passage. They fought with savage intensity, for if they failed, their families would be overrun. Each time a wight tried to climb over the wagon, they smashed its hands or chopped off its head. Fire pots, hastily crafted from clay jugs and lamp oil, helped stave off the mass of reanimated corpses. The defenders set them aflame, hurling them in arcs that splashed burning oil across the packed group of wights. For a time, the flames licked up, sending twisted shapes flailing. Victory was short-lived, however. The White Walkers were cunning enough to circle around. A shriek from behind told those defenders that their flank had been breached. In moments, the position collapsed. The wagon, once a barrier, became a hindrance for the frantic townsfolk who tried to flee. In the panic, many were cut down by claws and frozen steel. Flames flickered and died amid a swirl of freezing air. High on the southwestern battlements, Jaime Lannister arrived to find the men disorganized and on the brink of collapse. The walking corpses had massed at the gate below, and the White Walkers overseeing the assault seemed to flicker in the gloom like wraiths, striking swiftly before vanishing into the throng. A cluster of City Watch archers lined the parapets, loosing arrows at anything that moved. But the press of wights was too thick, and the cold too intense for them to maintain focus. Jaime clenched his jaw, the phantom ache in his missing hand pulsing as he gripped his sword with his remaining one. He bellowed at the watchmen to hold formation. Some recognized the Lord Commander's voice, or simply the tone of leadership, and managed to collect themselves. They formed a tighter arc along the stone battlement, each man's breath puffing in the icy night. "Loose arrows, call for oil, brace the door," Jaime snapped. His words came in quick bursts, barely audible above the frenzy of shrieks and clangs below. A group of men hefted a vat of boiling pitch to the edge, tipping it slowly so it cascaded down onto the wights who hammered at the gates. The dead creatures shrank away from the steaming torrent, their frozen limbs hissing and cracking where hot liquid touched them. As they stumbled, archers picked them off. For a fleeting moment, Jaime saw glimmers of hope. They were actually holding the southwestern gate. But then he caught sight of a White Walker standing near the foot of the wall. It raised a crystalline blade, murmuring something lost to the roar of the wind. The swirling cold around it surged upward like a geyser of frigid air. The boiling pitch that dripped over the parapet froze in midstream, fracturing into lumps of black ice that scattered. Shocked gasps from the defenders turned to horror as those lumps of once scalding pitch clattered uselessly onto the ground. Jaime cursed under his breath. It was like trying to fight the wind itself. A horse's scream of terror rang out from behind him. One of the stable hands must have tried to bring mounts for a potential evacuation. The horse's shrieking abruptly cut off, replaced by a gurgling cry. Jaime felt revulsion coil in his gut. He turned to a young gold cloak near him, who was shaking violently. "You go find Captain Lothar," Jaime said, speaking quickly. "We need every last bit of wildfire or oil we can muster at this gate. Move." The lad blinked, clearly terrified, but nodded and stumbled off. Jaime tried to steady himself. He could not let fear cripple him. If this gate fell, the Red Keep would be vulnerable from two directions. He peered over the parapet again, scanning the gloom. The press of wights was relentless. Tattered forms of men, women, and the unrecognizable shoulders packed tight, arms outstretched. Dozens turned their faces skyward, jaws hanging open, eyes milky white. Beneath them, more hands scrabbled for purchase on the stonework. They had begun to climb, using each other's bodies as handholds, an unholy ramp of corpses. Jamie banged a mailed fist against the wall. "Archers, cut them down!" His voice thundered. Arrows whipped through the air, striking undead forms. Some tumbled away, but it was like trying to stem a tide with a few pebbles. The whites redoubled their efforts, scrambling and clawing. A hush descended across the southwestern battlements, as if the very night inhaled. Then one of the White Walkers, perched below like a pale sentinel, turned its head upward. Jamie felt an indescribable chill as that blue gaze swept over him. The creature lifted its blade and pointed it toward Jamie. The swirling frieze expanded, and in one shockwave of cold, the stone beneath Jamie's boots cracked with a resounding snap. He staggered, nearly losing his footing. The men near him cried out as the parapet began to split. Then the entire section of wall crumbled outward, sending rocks and men tumbling into the courtyard below. Jamie, heart pounding, threw himself backward at the last moment. The walkway beneath him groaned, an avalanche of debris plummeting into the darkness. At least half a dozen defenders fell screaming, their voices cut off as they landed among the ravenous dead. Jamie clung to a jagged edge of what remained, cursing the trembling in his arms. He hoisted himself up, fear gnawing at his insides. Near him, a battered guard tried to do the same, but a chunk of falling stone struck the man's helmet, knocking him loose. Jamie heard the soldier's final scream as the dead seized him. For an instant, Jamie could only watch, horrified and helpless. Then he forced himself up onto the stable footing that remained of the battlements. The southwestern wall was critically damaged. Even from above, he could see whites streaming through the rubble where the wall had collapsed. A portion of the gatehouse tottered. If it went, hundreds more of the undead would pour in unimpeded. Jamie wiped sweat from his brow. He knew that without reinforcements, and soon, this section was lost. His eyes darted around, searching for some small advantage, anything to stem the tide. Then he saw a cluster of Lannister men near a storage tower, trying to ignite a barrel of wildfire. The faint green glow from the open lid told him everything. A single spark could light it, but the swirling cold threatened to quench every flame. No time to hesitate. Jamie hastened down a crumbling stairway, nearly losing his balance on the iced stone. He waved frantically to the men, signaling them to hurry. In the flickering light, he recognized one man from the Red Keep stables. The man was fumbling with flint and steel, hands shaking so violently he couldn't produce a spark. Another soldier, older and half-lamed, shielded the flint with a scrap of cloak, trying to keep the wind from blowing it out. Jamie arrived just as a group of whites closed in, perhaps a dozen. He stepped between the men and the threat, sword in hand, ignoring the burning ache in his shoulder. The first white lunged, a wiry creature with a partially caved-in skull. Jamie deflected its outstretched arms, then slashed at its knees, hacking it down. Another came from the side, hissing with open jaws. Jamie pivoted, the swirling cloak around his shoulders tangling in the creature's arms. He kicked it back, then drove his sword through its chest. Pointless, truly, for it did not die, but at least it reeled away. He could hear the frantic scrapes of the flint behind him. One spark, two sparks, fizzled and died. The cold was so intense that their breath hung in thick plumes. "Hurry!" Jamie snarled over his shoulder. More whites shambled forward, accompanied by something more horrifying, the reanimated remains of a city watch captain. Armor still bearing the gold cloak insignia, face half gone. That sight rattled Jamie. He remembered sharing a brief word with the man only days before. Now he was part of the legion of undead. Jamie steeled himself and stepped forward, slashing upward. His sword bit into the half-missing face, slicing through to the skull. The white faltered, but two more pressed in, rotting arms reaching for Jamie's throat. He retreated, parrying. If that wildfire barrel didn't ignite soon, they were finished. Suddenly, a faint hiss of flame crackled. The soldier behind Jamie shouted in triumph as the wick on the barrel flared green. Jamie risked a glance. A slender, unstable spark of wildfire danced on the fuse. No time to linger. "Light it and throw it," Jamie commanded. The men slid the heavy container toward the edge of the rubble. trying to position it where it could do the most harm. Whites closed in from all sides and Jaime roared as he batted them away. He felt pain lance through his calf when one White's clawed hand raked him. Blood soaked through his breeches, but adrenaline numbed him to the worst of it. At last, with straining arms, the soldiers tipped the barrel over a collapsed segment of the wall. The explosion that followed tore through the night, a bloom of green fire that momentarily turned the courtyard into daylight, tinted with emerald. A shockwave knocked Jaime and his companions to the ground. Whites directly below were obliterated, fragments of limbs raining across the cobblestones. The inferno licked outward, turning the rubble into an infernal beacon. Even a White Walker, standing too close, staggered in the glow, its frosty armor hissing and cracking. The men around Jaime blinked in astonishment. Had they managed to harm one of the walkers? Yet the creature recovered quickly, raising its weapon as though to smother the flames. This time, though, the wildfire erupted in a chain reaction. Smaller caches stored in that section of the wall ignited in rapid succession, unleashing multiple jets of roiling green. Sparks flew in all directions. The White Walker withdrew, perhaps wounded or simply cautious. The swirl of frost around it diminished, unable to extinguish the entire conflagration at once. Taking advantage, Jaime stumbled to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his leg. Fall back now," he called to the men. The southwestern gatehouse was a ruin, but at least it was wreathed in vicious green flames. For a short while, that corridor would be impassable to the undead. Jaime knew it would not last forever. The White Walkers might find another way around, or they might eventually snuff out the flames. But it bought precious time. With supporting arms from a pair of soldiers, Jaime limped away from the blast site, retreating deeper into the city. Smoke and the faint stench of scorched flesh followed them. Farther east, in the labyrinthine heart of King's Landing, Qyburn's network of servants guided citizens into half-collapsed buildings or barricaded courtyards. Their instructions were simple: keep quiet, keep warm if possible, and wait. Qyburn himself had taken refuge near the Grand Beller Sept, though the once magnificent building stood dark and shuttered. The High Sparrow's puritanical reign was long over, but the Sept remained a fortress-like structure that could hold a throng of survivors. Now, Qyburn paced inside its echoing corridors, conferring with lesser alchemists and a few acolytes who had chosen to remain. They had dragged a handful of wildfire canisters through the immense doors and rigged them around the perimeter. At the first sign that the White Walkers sought to breach the Sept, they would unleash another wave of green fury. Qyburn's eyes glinted with uneasy fascination as he looked upon the carved statues of the Seven. How fitting, he thought, that the very gods these people prayed to stood silent in stone, while a new form of death claimed the city. He tried to swallow the bitter lump in his throat. Of all his obsessions with necromancy and unnatural arts, never had he imagined an entire host of whites marching on King's Landing. But there was no time for reflection. A messenger burst through the heavy doors, panting, eyes wide. "They're close. Maybe a street away," the man gasped. There's no stopping them. The city's on fire in some places. Others are blanketed in ice. No one knows what to do." Qyburn nodded briskly, gesturing for the man to help fasten a chain across the entrance. Their plan was to funnel the undead into a choke point if they stormed the Sept, then detonate the wildfire. A grim plan, but the only one that might buy more time for scattered survivors. Circe, meanwhile, prowled the Red Keep's highest corridors, ignoring the pleas of her handmaidens to stay away from the windows. She peered out at the city, her green eyes narrow with fury. Smoke rose in sinuous plumes from multiple locations, tinted eerie shades by the moonlight and the sporadic bursts of wildfire. Screams, though distant, seemed to come from every direction. She drew her cloak tighter around her shoulders, ignoring the piercing cold that seeped through the stone. Within her, a storm of emotions raged. She wanted to preserve her power, to protect Tommen, to keep the Lannister name unblemished. But what did any of that matter if an ancient darkness claimed them all? She turned on her heel, the hem of her gown brushing the dusty floor. A small knot of courtiers trailed after her. One, a stammering lord with watery eyes, demanded to know the plan for evacuation. Another insisted they should mount ships in the Blackwater Bay and sail south. She rounded on them, voice ice cold. If you think the others cannot cross water or freeze it solid, you're welcome to test that theory. I will not abandon the city. Her words were clipped, though a thread of hysteria lingered just beneath them. The courtiers shrank back at her wrath. A breathless steward appeared, bearing news that the southwestern wall had been partially demolished but temporarily sealed off by wildfire. Jaime had survived, the steward said, though wounded. Cersei clenched her fists. A small wave of relief washed over her. Jaime lived for now. She had already lost so much. She refused to lose him as well. She ordered the steward to ensure a group of men be sent to reinforce or help him. The steward bowed and dashed away. Another messenger came with an even grimmer report. In several wards, pockets of the living were succumbing to the whites, and once they fell, they rose again. The undead were multiplying from within the city. The Red Keep's gates stood mostly shut now, allowing only a trickle of battered soldiers to enter. For letting in refugees en masse risked letting in the infected or the reanimated. Thus, entire districts of King's Landing were effectively cut off. Cersei resumed her pacing, each step echoing. She passed a tall window from which she could see a glimpse of the Iron Throne's tower. A memory flickered. The day Tommen had first sat upon it. Small and unsure, dwarfed by the twisted metal. She had believed then that her cunning would be enough to safeguard the realm. How small that cunning felt in the face of a threat older than any empire. Yet she was not a woman known for giving in. If the city fell, she would burn it to the ground rather than let it become a stronghold for these creatures. The notion frightened and emboldened her at once. "We are not finished," she murmured under her breath, ignoring the anxious courtiers behind her. "We are not finished yet." Below in Maegor's holdfast, Tommen sat hunched on a bench near a crackling hearth fire, though the flames barely dispelled the creeping chill. Ser Boros Blount, Ser Meryn Trant, and another Kingsguard stood vigil. The boy's face was pale, streaked with tears he tried hard to contain. He could hear the dying city, the howls, the clang of steel, the eerie wails that seemed to come from the very walls. He wished he had an older brother or a father to show him what to do. All he had was the memory of Margaery's kindness, the ghost of a dream that once promised happiness. Outside the thick doors of the holdfast, additional guards scurried about, carrying news of the White Walkers to and fro. A single priest of the faith was led in to speak with the king, but Tommen had no appetite for prayers. He only asked again and again if anyone would bring Sir Pounce, his beloved cat, to him, or if someone would tell him that the city would be safe by morning. Each time, the look in the guard's eyes told him there were no comforting lies left to give. He clutched the arms of the bench until his fingers went numb. "I don't want to lose my people," he said in a trembling voice to Ser Meryn. The Kingsguard, uncertain how to respond, simply nodded and pledged they would keep him from harm. But Tommen noticed the uncertain flicker in the knight's gaze. Beyond the Red Keep's walls, in the once bustling market squares, the undead roamed freely. Tendrils of ice crackled over the cobbles, where whites shuffled aimlessly, occasionally coalescing into larger groups under the silent direction of the White Walkers. In the glow of scattered fires, one could see the outlines of old stalls, the remains of half-eaten food, and personal possessions dropped by those who had fled or died. On one corner, a child's wooden doll sat in a puddle of dirty slush, its painted face chipped and splintered. Nearby, half a dozen whites leaned over a fallen soldier, tearing at his flesh with blackened fingers. Their movements were jerky but methodical, every piece of living warmth a new trophy in their march toward oblivion. In an alley not far from the Dragon Pit, a small group of defenders still held out. They were men from the city's smithies and tanneries, too stubborn or too desperate to give up. Armed with hammers and picks, they had chosen a narrow choke point where the undead had to advance single file. Overhead, a walkway connected two buildings, providing an elevated perch for those with crossbows. The defenders fired again and again into the throng. The whites pressed forward, climbing over each other's husks. One of the defenders, a burly smith with soot-stained hands, swung a massive hammer that crushed the skull of a white in one blow, splattering rotten gore. Another hammered spikes into the chest of an advancing corpse, pinning it against the alley wall. For a brief moment they cheered. But then the temperature plummeted. A white walker glided into view at the far end of the alley, its pale skin shimmering beneath ragged cloth. The men in front parted in fear, some stepping back. The smith with the hammer spat on the ground, mustering courage. "Damn you," he roared, brandishing his weapon. The walker's blue eyes found him. It raised a sword carved of frosted crystal and advanced. The smith swung his hammer with all the strength in his arms. In a blur of motion, the walker deflected it, the hammer's metal head snapping clean off the shaft in an explosion of ice particles. The smith stumbled, disbelief in his eyes. He had time for only a grunt before the walker plunged its blade into his chest. The cold was immediate, racing through his veins, turning his scream into a choked rasp. He toppled. The other defenders recoiled. They tried to fire crossbow bolts, but the walker's swirling aura of cold seemed to deflect them. Then it was among them, blade flashing with inhuman grace. Screams filled the narrow alley. Bodies fell. Within seconds, the defenders were scattered or dead. The walkway overhead, battered by the walker's frost-laden gale, collapsed, taking the crossbowmen with it. One tried to crawl away, but the walker's spear pinned him to the ground. A moment later, the alley was quiet save for the hissing rasp of the whites as they clambered forward to claim the fresh corpses. And thus another pocket of resistance was snuffed out. Above the battlement near the Red Keep, the swirling shapes of crows circled. The city's gloom had drawn carrion birds that sensed the carnage below. Their cawing was swallowed by the din of battle. On one higher turret, Bronn peered out, flanked by 2 Lannister crossbowmen. His normally jaunty demeanor was subdued, though an undercurrent of grim humor still flickered in his eyes. "If I survive this," he muttered, "remind me to never again bet on a quiet night in King's Landing." He hefted a crossbow of his own, scanning the torchlit darkness. Far below, he could see the flicker of green flames near the southwestern gate, lines of whites attempting to skirt the inferno. A single white walker stood at a distance, seemingly in command. "Think you can hit that big one?" one of the crossbowmen asked, voice trembling. Bronn pursed his lips. "Hard to say. Harder to kill if I do, but let's give it a go." He aimed carefully, exhaled, and fired. The bolt whistled through the air. The White Walker turned its head, and the bolt shattered on an unseen swirl of frost. Bronn cursed. "Bloody magic wind." He gestured for the crossbowman to hand him another bolt. "We'll keep it busy at least. Keep shooting, and maybe the bugger might get bored." They let loose a volley. Each shot ended the same. The walker advanced toward the southwestern portion of the keep, ignoring them. Another deep rumble shook the night. A second explosion of wildfire from some distant quarter. The horizon flashed green, then faded into plumes of black smoke. It was as though segments of the city were spontaneously combusting. Bronn's lips tightened. He knew what that meant. Final gambles being played out. Those explosions did not halt the undead. They would reduce King's Landing to a ruin of ash and twisted metal. And still, the White Walkers showed no sign of retreat. Within the Red Keep's courtyard, the battered remnants of Lannister forces and the City Watch had formed a ragged defense line. Makeshift barricades, stacked barrels, and overturned wagons created a perimeter. Archers crouched behind crates. Swordsmen waited in a crouch for the onslaught. Bodies of the fallen, some scorched black, others frozen stiff, lay strewn about. The cold radiated through the night air, and even the flames from torches seemed to flicker weakly, as if starved of oxygen. Jaime, limping from his wound, arrived with a handful of men who had managed to break away from the southwestern wall. They collapsed into the courtyard, panting, eyes hollow with fatigue. A knight rushed to Jaime's side, helping him remain upright. "My lord, do we know if the queen is safe?" the knight asked. Jaime nodded, short of breath. "She's in the keep. At least she was when I left. We must hold here, or nowhere." He leaned against a battered wooden pillar, ignoring the throbbing agony in his leg. Sweat coursed down his brow. He recalled the image of the White Walker in the flames, how it had recoiled, if only briefly. At least that was something. They could be hurt, if the conditions were right. But how to replicate that without destroying the entire city in the process? He surveyed the courtyard. Despair gnawed at him. He recognized some faces, men from the War of the Five Kings, veterans who had fought in the Battle of the Blackwater. They looked more frightened now than they ever had facing mortal armies. Overhead, the sky's darkness was faintly tinged by the approach of dawn. Or so Jaime prayed. The horizon showed a subtle gray. Would the White Walkers recoil from the sun? Old tales suggested they might. Yet Jaime worried it would not matter. They had already permeated so many streets, claimed so many lives. Even if the sun's rays forced the White Walkers to retreat for a time, the Whites might remain, and the damage was already catastrophic. Nearby, a door banged open as Qyburn stumbled into the courtyard, accompanied by a pair of nervous alchemists. Carts rattled behind them, loaded with more wildfire casks. Jaime tensed. "You want to unleash all of that in here?" he asked, voice rough. Qyburn's face was drawn. "Better we hold it in readiness than lose it to the dead, my lord. They're at the sept, at the gates. Soon they'll be here." He gestured for workers to place barrels along the courtyard's perimeter. It was a final line of destruction, ready to incinerate friend and foe alike if it came to that. Jaime raked a hand through his hair. "If we do this, the keep might stand. But the city?" He didn't finish. The city was already awash in flame and terror. Qyburn gave a hesitant nod, swallowing. "We must preserve something for the living. The Red Keep may be the last bastion." Jaime glanced away, inhaling sharply. He could almost hear Tyrion's sarcastic remark from years past about turning the city to ash and bone. "Help me to my sister," Jaime said at last. "I need to speak with her." Soldiers assisted him across the courtyard toward the inner steps. With each hobbling movement, he saw the haunted gazes of those too injured or exhausted to continue. Fear strangled the air. He noticed a scattering of small folk huddling under arches, faces streaked with soot, clutching children. The specter of winter pressed upon them all. Inside the Red Keep's corridors, the cold felt no less intense. Jaime's breath fogged as he made his way to the chamber where he expected to find Cersei. The torches lining the walls sputtered in the drafts. He passed a row of shattered windows, their glass broken by the shockwaves from earlier explosions. The once grand tapestries of royal triumphs fluttered in the icy wind. At last, Jaime found his sister pacing outside the throne room, her hair disheveled and eyes bright with desperation. She turned at his approach, inhaling sharply when she saw the blood on his leg and the weary slump of his shoulders. "You're hurt," she said, voice trembling. Jaime waved it off. "No time. Qyburn is placing wildfire in the courtyard. The southwestern wall is collapsed. The dead are pouring through the city." He paused to catch his breath. "If dawn doesn't drive them back, we might have to." He trailed off, knowing she could fill in the rest. Cersei's jaw clenched. "We burn them all if we must." The words were savage, but her eyes shone with unshed tears. Jaime gazed at her, torn between revulsion and sympathy. The memory of the Mad King's last threat, "Burn them all," beat in his mind like a cursed drum. He had killed Aerys to prevent that atrocity. Now it seemed, fate was mocking him by presenting the same horrifying dilemma in the shape of ice rather than fire. Before Jaime could respond, a low, hollow boom shook the keep. Dust trickled from the ceiling. One of the guards near the corridor turned pale. "They're here," he murmured. "By the gods, they're at the gates of the keep." The notion that the White Walkers had already advanced so far into the stronghold made Jaime's heart pound. He met Cersei's gaze. Neither spoke, but the unthinkable weighed on them both. She whirled toward the guard. "Get every man we have to defend that gate. Close off all corridors leading from there. We'll meet them at the front hall if we must." Her tone was iron hard, leaving no room for argument. The guard saluted and rushed off, shouting orders. The corridor erupted into frantic activity as more men assembled, weapons clanking. Jaime turned to Cersei. "If the worst comes to pass." She cut him off with a raised hand. "We fight or we die." She said it with a finality that echoed. The last stand was upon them, and both Lannisters understood that they had precious little left to lose. They hurried through a warren of narrow passages that led to the great hall's entrance, passing cowering servants who pressed themselves flat against the walls. Several sworn knights in gold cloaks joined them along the way. In the great hall itself, torchlight flickered across the walls, revealing the iron throne at the far end. A silhouette of metal blades, monstrous in the gloom. Soldiers rushed to form ranks before the throne, determined to make a final stand if the keep's main doors fell. The dais upon which the throne stood loomed, like an altar of sacrifice. Cersei ascended a few steps, looking out over the men. Her chin lifted, regal despite her trembling hands. "Your king trusts in your valor," she declared, voice carrying through the cavernous space. "I trust in it. We have defended King's Landing before, and we will not yield now. Any man who stands with me will be remembered as a hero." It was a speech formed more of desperation than conviction, yet it drew a ragged cheer from those present. Some brandished their swords in salute. Others remained grimly silent. Jaime took position near her, sword in hand, though he could feel his pulse hammering. The wound in his leg throbbed, his chest heaving. He was no stranger to battle, but never had he faced an enemy so alien, so impervious to reason or fear. A hush settled upon the hall as they waited, each second stretching like a taut string. From somewhere deep in the keep came the clamorous echo of steel on stone, the rasp of the undead. The cold in the air intensified, as if a door had been opened to a frozen tundra. The torches guttered, some winking out entirely. Darkness crawled across the floor. A pounding on the great hall doors reverberated through the chamber. Splintering wood. Soldiers tightened their grips, stepping forward. Then, with a shriek of twisting hinges, the doors gave way. Night's chill flooded in, carrying tendrils of fog. Wights, a mass of them, stumbled forward with mindless hunger. The defenders unleashed a volley of arrows. Some undead dropped, others lurched past their fallen. Behind them pale shapes loomed. White walkers, eyes glinting azure in the torchlight. "Hold!" Cersei cried. The defenders clashed with the front rank of wights in a flurry of steel and screams. Jaime threw himself into the fray, ignoring the pain. He slashed and thrust, severing limbs and cleaving heads from necks. But for every wight that dropped, another took its place. The hall erupted into chaos, men shouting, metal ringing. One of the White Walkers, standing near the threshold, lifted an ice-forged spear. A gust of frigid wind extinguished half the torches in a single breath. Darkness closed in, broken only by the dancing glow of a few remaining flames. Soldiers cried out in fear. Cersei, perched on the dais, watched the undead surge closer. She grabbed a bow from a fallen guard and notched an arrow, hands shaking. Her shot took a wight in the throat, but it barely slowed. Another arrow, and another. She found her gaze drifting to the far corner of the hall, where the remains of an alcove housed hidden stores of wildfire. If the living began to fall, if the White Walkers claimed the throne itself, she knew what she had to do. The heartbreak of that knowledge twisted her features. The city might already be lost, but she would not let these creatures sit upon the seat of Targaryen conquest. Jaime, cutting down a wight at the feet of the throne steps, felt a wave of cold behind him. He spun, sword raised, to see a White Walker gliding forward, sword of ice poised to strike. It moved with impossible speed. Jaime braced himself, preparing to parry. Their blades met, in a clash that rang like shattering glass. Jaime's sword cracked, chips of metal flying. The shock nearly tore the hilt from his hand. He staggered, and the walker thrust again. He jerked aside, the frosted tip grazing his shoulder, instantly numbing his arm. Stumbling, he tried to recover, but the walker pursued relentlessly, expressionless except for those glowing eyes. A desperate yell came from the side as one of the king's guards lunged to intercept. Halberd swinging. The White Walker swept the halberd aside, then skewered the man. The guard collapsed, frost enveloping his body from within. Another blow from the walker shattered him in a burst of ice crystals. Jaime, panting, tried to muster a final thrust with his half-broken sword. He aimed for the walker's torso, hoping to at least distract it. The blade clanged off the creature's icy armor. It turned its head, as if in disdain. Then it raised its weapon high. Time seemed to slow. Jaime saw the flash of the White Walker's blade descending. He raised his arm, bracing for an impact that would likely tear him apart. But at that instant, A burst of green fire erupted from the side. A spear of wildfire launched by a frantic soldier who had hurled a clay pot. The searing emerald flame splashed across the walker's back. It screeched, twisting in agony as tendrils of heat clashed with its icy form. For a moment, Jamie caught a glimpse of its face contorting in a snarl of rage and pain. The walker whipped around, swirling an arc of frost in an attempt to extinguish the flames. Some of the green tongues flickered out, but not before searing deep wounds into its pale flesh. Jamie seized the opportunity. With the last of his strength, he lunged, driving his cracked steel sword into the weakened patch on the walker's midsection. A sound like breaking ice echoed in the hall. The walker staggered, eyes bright with fury. Then the crack spread, fracturing across its torso. In a burst of frosty shards, it disintegrated into a shower of ice and swirling mist. Jamie staggered back, unable to believe what he'd done. The soldier who had thrown the wildfire pot stared, too shocked to cheer. For the first time, they had witnessed the death of a White Walker within these walls. But there was no time to savor the moment. Another White Walker strode in, leading more whites. Jamie gasped for breath, struggling to stay on his feet. The defenders fought on, swords chipping against unholy ice. All the while, the dreadful possibility loomed. If the White Walkers overwhelmed them, it would take but a moment for Qyburn or Cersei to ignite the massive caches of wildfire hidden in the Red Keep. The city that had suffered through so many conflicts would erupt in the biggest conflagration in history. Blood slicked the floor, steaming in the cold. Screams rang from every side. Cersei fired arrow after arrow until her quiver emptied. Then she drew a dagger, cursing that she had never learned the finer points of swordsmanship. She scanned the chaos for Tommen, who had been spirited away to a secure chamber. If everything failed, she thought, at least he might be spared. Though from what future, she could not guess. Suddenly, a wavering horn call echoed through the hall. At first, Jamie thought it was the White Walker's eerie wail. Then he realized it was coming from outside, a deeper, more vibrant tone. One of the defenders near the door shouted something indistinct. Another blast followed, reverberating in the great hall. The White Walkers paused, heads tilted as if listening. Even the whites hesitated. A bizarre moment of stillness descending over the carnage. Could it be reinforcements? Jamie's mind raced, trying to recall which banners might have marched south. Or was it something else entirely, another terror, or perhaps a trick of the wind? He could not know. But as the horn sounded a third time, a faint glow touched the windows of the hall. Dawn? Or some new fire? Jamie, chest heaving, looked to Cersei. Hope kindled in her eyes, though it warred with dread. They both knew that if the sun rose, it might hamper the others. But would it banish them outright, or only show how thoroughly they had already claimed the city? For a suspended heartbeat, King's Landing seemed to hover between the black pit of despair and the faintest glimmer of salvation. The horns called again, deeper, echoing over the blood-stained streets, resonating off the battered walls. Dawn's first light spilled across the horizon, casting long shadows through the broken doors of the great hall. The White Walkers hissed, whites moaning in confusion. Soldiers shielded their eyes from the sudden brightness. Green flames flickered among shattered ice, and the chorus of the city's bells mixed with the forlorn horns that signaled a final turning of fate. A hush settled, a moment suspended in time. Cersei and Jamie stood side by side, hearts pounding, as rays of pale sunlight lanced the darkness, illuminating the torn banners and the twisted remnants of the city's defenders. The next moments would decide everything, whether this faint dawn brought respite, or if the White Walkers could harness the day just as they had the night. No one dared to move, each breath ragged and charged with the knowledge that, even on the brink of ruin, the smallest spark of hope could still ignite an unexpected victory, or a final, desperate cataclysm that would engulf them all. For an agonizing moment, no one dared breathe. Dawn's first pale light gleamed across the blood-smeared tiles of the throne room, painting every broken weapon and fallen body with a fragile glow. The horns that had cut through the violence seemed impossibly distant now, their resonance fading among the city's ruins. Jaime stood, sword clutched in his shaking hand, blood trickling down his leg. Cersei remained poised on the dais near the Iron Throne, her dagger still raised from the last desperate strike she had made. Across the hall, the White Walkers who had forced their way inside paused in uncanny stillness, as though testing the newborn sunlight that slanted in through the shattered doors. Some of the Whites hissed, a sound like boiling tar. Their milky eyes reflected the creeping dawn, and their limbs twitched uncertainly. Others pressed forward, as mindless as ever, clashing with the defenders in a renewed scuffle of steel and brittle bone. Men groaned with exhaustion, staggering beneath the weight of hours of combat. Yet in many hearts, that sliver of dawn brought a spark of hope, kindling the last reserves of courage they did not know they possessed. A few defenders rushed to reform ranks, shouting for each other, bolstering lines that had begun to crumble. Their voices carried with them a desperate rallying cry. "We are still alive." One of the White Walkers stepped fully into a beam of morning light, sword of ice clenched in its pale hand. Steam or mist curled around its body, a reaction to the warmth of day. It did not burst into flame or disintegrate on the spot. No such simple reprieve. But there was a visible recoil, as though the glow of the sun made it uneasy. A low, whispery snarl emanated from its parted lips. This shift was not a rout, but it was hesitation. Jaime caught the sign and pointed with his battered blade. "They don't like the sun," he rasped, voice hoarse from shouting. "Press them back." The defenders needed no second prompting. They lurched forward in a clumsy but spirited assault, steel meeting the undead with renewed force. Some Whites, pinned in the half-light, jerked around as though disoriented. Others remained unaffected, unstoppable as always, raking their frozen fingers through armor and flesh. But the advantage had at least changed in the smallest measure. Another White Walker tried to coat the floor in a sheen of ice, but the rising warmth of day undercut its power, weakening the effect. Men found steadier footing, used the momentary reprieve to strike at the ankles or spines of the Whites. Cersei, perched on the dais, lowered her dagger. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Dawn had arrived. Perhaps the city was not completely lost, yet. She glanced around, catching sight of Qyburn at the edge of the hall, his face drawn and streaked with soot. With a curt nod, she signaled him not to ignite the wildfire that had been planted beneath the floor and along key corridors, at least not this very instant. Qyburn dabbed sweat from his brow and gave a shaky nod in return. Outside, the horn sounded again, a little closer this time. Jaime's heart clenched. He shouted to a man near the doors, "Find the source of that. Who blows those horns?" The soldier hesitated, torn between his defensive post and obeying the command. Jaime waved at a second man. "You go. Report back with what you see. If any host has come, we must know whether they're friend or foe." The soldier dashed out, sword clutched in his hand, dodging the wreckage strewn across the threshold. Through the open doorway, the great hall's defenders could glimpse the battered courtyard, littered with corpses, both living and dead. A swirl of green flame from a spent wildfire cask still flickered in one corner, producing an acrid stench. The once pristine walls, blackened by soot, gave the place a haunting, post-battle aura. But the battle was not yet finished. Jaime pressed forward, ignoring the throb in his wounded leg. He parried a White's clumsy lunge, then slammed the hilt of his sword into its skull, splintering old bone. The creature sagged. Before it could rise, another defender drove a spear into its back. Jaime nodded in quick gratitude. His gaze swept the hall, seeking any sign of Tommen or the critical pockets of survivors. The stench of decay mingled with the harsh tang of smoke. Dawn spilled in more forcefully now, brightening the gloom. At the same time, the White Walkers began to draw back, almost imperceptibly, from the strongest beams of direct sunlight. Their eyes glowed with anger or frustration, some unreadable, ancient emotion. One raised its sword, chanting in that alien tongue that sounded like ice cracking on a winter lake. The Whites near it jerked upright, moving away from the light. They retreated a step at a time, reforming in a vague formation near the door. Soldiers took advantage of the moment, rallying around wounded comrades, pulling them toward safer positions deeper in the hall. More defenders scrambled to push the whites back, driving them closer to the open courtyard, where the sun could reach them more fully. Cersei descended from the dais, stepping gingerly around pools of congealing blood. She caught Jaime's arm. "We have to press them out entirely. Drive them from the keep if dawn weakens them." She paused, biting her lip. "If we can rout them, perhaps we can save what remains." Her voice was tight, with the knowledge that so much was already lost. Jaime nodded, swallowing the dryness in his throat. "Agreed. Gather every man. We converge in the yard and drive them through the gates." He glanced at Qyburn. "Have your wildfire men ready, but do not detonate unless it's our last resort." "Understood." Qyburn bowed, relief in his eyes. He hurried away, directing his subordinates to secure the volatile substances. Thus began a precarious push from within the great hall. The defenders, knights, gold cloaks, sellswards who had joined for coin, and even a handful of stable hands, united in a furious surge to clear the corridor. The White Walkers moved at a measured pace, herding their whites ahead of them as a shield against sunlight. Any direct beam that caught a walker's form caused it to recoil, though not disintegrate. Their ice blades still cut deep, and each yard gained cost the defenders more blood. At last they forced their way into the courtyard. The scene there was heart-wrenching. Battered men, piles of corpses and smoldering fires. The southwestern corner still blazed with remnants of green flame, black smoke curling upward, and beyond the courtyard gates, King's Landing sprawled in ruin. The White Walkers that led the assault on the keep had begun to cluster, all staring with frosty malice at the ranks of men. The sun inched higher, painting the top of the keep with gold. The courtyard's center lay in shadow, but the upper ramparts and towers gleamed in the morning light. Suddenly, the soldier Jaime had dispatched to scout came racing back through a side passage. He was pale, chest-heaving. "My lord!" Riders approached the city from the southeast. They bear the banners of Highgarden. He paused, breathless. "I saw the golden rose on green." Cersei stiffened, recalling her tenuous relationship with House Tyrell. Most of the Tyrell family had been wiped out in the Sept explosion and subsequent power shifts, leaving only distant relations and uncertain allies. Any Tyrell loyalists she had not swayed were presumably enemies. Why would they come now, and with how large a force? Jaime frowned, remembering the shared animosity. But he also understood that any living host might prove a boon in the face of the undead. He motioned the soldier closer. "How many did you see? A mere token force or an army?" The soldier inhaled. "Hard to tell, my lord. I glimpsed banners, cavalry, perhaps a few hundred men. They rode with speed, as though they were aware of the city's peril. I heard horns. Maybe more are behind them." Jaime's mind whirled. If these men truly came to help, they might assault the White Walkers' flank, possibly drawing some of the undead away from the keep. But Tyrell men had no particular love for the Lannisters, not after all the betrayals and intrigues. Could they be aiming to take advantage of the city's devastation? He glanced at Cersei. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She set her jaw. "We have no choice but to hope they fight on the side of the living. Send a signal. If they're wise, they'll see the city is overrun by a greater threat. They'd be fools to attack us instead of these monsters." Jaime nodded grimly. "They'd be risking their own annihilation if they ignore the White Walkers. But we can't count on them. We have to focus on driving these creatures out of the keep before the city truly becomes a graveyard." "Then Even as he spoke, the White Walkers in the courtyard advanced again. Taking advantage of an overcast swirl that temporarily dulled the sunlight, Jaime rallied those near him, perhaps 24 men still able to fight, and they struck with savage desperation, blocking the undead's attempt to breach deeper into the keep's wings. Cersei, though not a skilled fighter, ordered archers onto any vantage point they could find. Arrows rained from windows and balconies. While the whites remained vulnerable to repeated strikes, the White Walkers dodged or shattered the shafts in mid-air with that swirling frost. In a corner of the courtyard, Qyburn's men huddled behind barrels of wildfire, uncertain whether to ignite them. The swirling chaos made it impossible to guess who might be caught in the conflagration. So with trembling hands they stood ready, lighting small torches and waiting for the order that might never come. Within minutes, the defenders began to buckle under the relentless press of the whites. Here and there, small clusters of undead overwhelmed pockets of men. Screams echoed against the stone walls, and the living retreated further, forming a ragged circle around Cersei and Jaime. A single white walker, taller than the rest, stepped forward, brandishing a massive axe of translucent ice. It pointed the weapon at the dais that led to the Red Keep's interior, as though marking its intention to claim the fortress. A chilling hush fell. That hush was shattered by a horn blast, this one much closer. The gates that led to the city proper suddenly reverberated with the impact of galloping hooves. Shouts rose beyond the rubble, muffled but distinct. Then, through the splintered remains of the gate, came a wedge of cavalry. A half-dozen riders in battered armor bearing a golden rose standard. Each horse thundered onto cobblestones slick with blood and ice, hooves slipping but pressing forward. The men wore expressions of grim determination, swords raised. A second wedge followed, more cavalry, then ranks of foot soldiers pressed in. It was not a large army, but their sudden arrival in the courtyard drew the undead's attention. The lead rider, a knight with green plumes on his helm, spotted the White Walkers and the whites swarming the yard. Without hesitation he bellowed, "For Highgarden, for the Reach," and spurred his horse straight into the mass of undead. His men fanned out behind him, lances and swords flashing in the dawn light. The White Walker, with the axe, turned sharply, assessing this new threat. Its icy eyes narrowed in silent rage. It raised a hand, conjuring a blast of frosty wind to knock the horses aside. Several reared, tossing their riders, but more forced through, trampling whites underfoot. The yard erupted in renewed chaos, this time joined by the clash of steel from an unexpected ally. Jaime felt a surge of wild hope. He bellowed at the men around him, "Attack! Don't let them stand alone." They rushed forward, coordinating their assault with the Highgarden riders as best they could. Swords bit into undead flesh, lances skewered whites, and archers from the keep rained arrows onto any cluster of the dead that stood in the open. The White Walkers, forced to divide their attention, retreated several paces, swirling ice about them like protective cloaks. One was hammered by a well-aimed blow from a Tyrell knight's spiked mace, fracturing the walker's chest. It shrieked, recoiling, though it did not shatter outright. The knight pressed his advantage, swinging again. Frost coated his weapon, numbing his fingers. He roared and struck a third time, finally breaking through the walker's torso with a triumphant shout. The creature splintered into shards of ice, and the whites nearby staggered. Cersei watched all of this from behind a partial barricade, her dagger clutched in white-knuckled fingers. The courtyard had become a swirling tapestry of violence. Men in green liveried surcoats fighting alongside gold cloaks and battered defenders, all struggling to stay alive against the unnatural tide. She spotted a younger knight from the new arrivals crossing swords with another White Walker. Icy shards flew with every collision. That sense of combined arms, two houses that had once been at bitter odds, was surreal. She remembered the conspiracies that had pitted the Tyrells against the crown, the resentment that had brewed between their families. Now all of that seemed trivial in the face of the undead apocalypse. She ducked as a white, sword overhead, flung by a charging horse that crashed into the fray. Qyburn's men, seeing the opening made by the cavalry, darted forward with torches to set whites aflame. Some of the undead froze the torches with an instantaneous blast of chill. Others shrieked as the flames caught and devoured their decaying flesh. The smell was horrific, an acrid mix of burning rot and icy wind that assaulted every lungful of air. Still, the defenders pressed on, determined to exploit the new advantage. Some of the Tyrell cavalry peeled away to secure the courtyard's perimeter, trying to block the whites from flooding in from side streets. Arrows sliced overhead, and more horns sounded beyond the broken gates, announcing the approach of additional men in green and gold livery. It was no grand host, but any reinforcements were better than none. Together, they fought to contain the White Walkers' presence. Jamie found himself dueling side by side with a tall, broad-shouldered Tyrell soldier whose heavy halberd proved effective at keeping whites at bay. They carved a path toward the largest White Walker, the one wielding the translucent axe. Snow, or something akin to it, swirled around that towering creature, making it difficult to see its exact movements. When it swung, the air whistled. The impact cracked stone and sent defenders reeling. A single blow decapitated a Tyrell rider who ventured too close. Jamie clenched his teeth and held firm, lunging whenever the walker's back was turned. Though his sword was chipped from the earlier battle, he aimed for the walker's joints, hoping for a repeat of the fracturing effect. But the creature moved with startling speed. Each time Jamie thought he might land a meaningful strike, the walker spun away, leaving only a swirl of frost and a bone-chilling gust that numbed Jamie's wounded leg further. The sky grew gradually brighter. Slivers of sunlight reached deeper into the courtyard, creeping across rubble and corpses. The White Walker's power, while not extinguished, seemed noticeably hampered by the direct light. Their conjured storms grew less potent, unable to freeze entire sections of the courtyard at once. Men found themselves sliding less frequently on black ice. A few whites collapsed entirely, as though the night's magic that sustained them had run thin. But most still fought on, unstoppable puppets of death. Farther back, near the keep's walls, Tommen appeared with a small contingent of Kingsguard, who had finally persuaded him to flee deeper chambers. The boy king gazed upon the courtyard in horror. He had never seen war at such close range, much less a battle against the undead. His face was as pale as the whites themselves. Yet he mustered what bravery he could. He let out a shaky breath and addressed a group of archers perched on a landing above. Fire, fire at will, he managed, voice cracking. Sir Meryn Trant put a protective hand on his shoulder, glancing nervously at the roiling melee below. Jamie, spotting his nephew's son from the corner of his eye, felt an odd swirl of emotions. Relief that Tommen was alive, dread at the thought he might be injured here. But there was no time to force him back into hiding. The boy had already seen too much. Jamie pressed forward, hacking at a white that lunged for his exposed flank. The blow connected with a spurt of dark ichor. The white staggered. Half of its torso cleaved away, but its hand still clawed at Jamie's tunic. He kicked it aside, teeth gritted. A moment later, horns blared again from the main gate. More Tyrell foot soldiers filed in, grappling with whites near the archway. The courtyard was jammed. The undead had begun to fall back in some places, though not in a simple retreat. White Walkers still directed them with silent gestures, funneling the whites toward narrower paths where the sun did not fully reach. Step by agonizing step, the living advanced, trying to encircle them, trying to force them out. Then, with a resonant crack, the White Walker commander, the massive one with the axe, slammed its weapon into the ground. Ice shards erupted in a ring, flinging men back like rag dolls. Whites rushed in to exploit the confusion, lunging onto prone knights, ripping into them with savage hunger. Another swirl of gloom passed over the sun as a gray cloud slid across the sky, allowing the White Walkers a moment to assert their power. In that shadow, the temperature plummeted again. Horses screamed. Men cursed, their teeth chattering. Jamie felt the raw cold biting into his armor, nearly freezing the moisture around his wound. Sensing a potential disaster, Cersei lifted her voice in a sharp call. The barrels, light them now. She pointed to the ring of wildfire casks that Qyburn's men had brought near the edges of the courtyard. Jamie snapped his head toward her, alarm sparking in his eyes. The plan had been to hold off igniting them to avoid mass casualties. But the sudden resurgence of the White Walkers' power threatened to decimate everyone if the whites advanced again. Qyburn, hearing her command, wavered, torn between caution and obedience. The cold grew fiercer. The living line wavered. Sensing it was the only choice left to avert a slaughter, Qyburn nodded at his men. Several torches dipped simultaneously toward the fuses. Jamie shouted, "Clear the barrels! Clear the barrels!" urging any defenders near the perimeter to back away. People scrambled, but the courtyard was so packed with men and whites that many had no room to run. In a dizzying series of thuds, the first casks erupted. Wildfire burst forth in violent emerald gouts. swirling upward in pillars of savage heat. The blasts knocked whites into the air, setting them ablaze in mid-flight. The courtyard roared with the sound of hungry flames devouring anything that stood too close. A wave of scorching wind rolled across the defenders. Those who had managed to retreat felt the heat claw at their armor and flesh. White Walkers hissed, raising arms to conjure a counterfreeze. But the sudden conflagration of so many barrels proved overwhelming. Green tongues of fire licked at the edges of the yard, racing up walls, incinerating bodies, living or dead. The White Walker with the axe howled in defiance as the wildfire caught it from behind. Its frost magic fought valiantly, swirling blasts of cold that tried to extinguish the emerald inferno. Steam burst in violent bursts, a haze that blinded many. Yet the flames persisted, fueled by the alchemical potency of the wildfire. One White Walker, on the far side of the yard, dissolved amid a shriek of cracking ice. Engulfed by the dancing flames, another retreated to the shadows, eyes blazing with hatred. Whites that were set ablaze flailed mindlessly, staggering into their brethren and spreading the fire further. Amid the swirling chaos, the living suffered too. Dozens of men were caught too near the barrels when they detonated. Shrapnel from the exploding casks shredded through skin and armor. Green fire clung to clothing and hair, burning them alive in seconds. Screams rang out over the courtyard as a pyre of bodies formed. Jaime staggered back from the heat, shielded his face with an upraised arm. His eyelashes singed, the flesh of his exposed hand scorched painfully. But the whites that had pinned his line down were briefly scattered, giving him room to maneuver. Cersei coughed in the choking smoke, eyes streaming tears from the stinging fumes. She'd known this might happen, had accepted the risk that her own men would burn. Even so, the horror of it took her breath away. This was no orderly stand. It was an inferno. Yet beyond the smoke, she glimpsed White Walkers forced into retreat, their icy powers no match for the total conflagration. She forced herself to stand straight, projecting strength as she waved the survivors forward to press the advantage. The Tyrell cavalry, though still alive, fought to clear a path around the blazing ring, enabling more men to surge into the center of the courtyard. Some of the whites collapsed, turned to charcoal lumps in the flames. Others reeled, momentarily leaderless. The White Walker with the axe, battered by the fire, retreated toward the shattered gate, assembling the surviving undead in a protective cluster. It glowered at the living with burning blue eyes, as though memorizing their faces for vengeance. As the firestorm raged, the cloud overhead slid away from the sun, revealing bright morning light once more. The combined glare of sunlight and green wildfire bathed the courtyard in hellish brilliance. The White Walker commander snarled again. Swirling frost. This time, the swirl was weaker, battered by the twin onslaught of dawn's warmth and the unstoppable conflagration. Recognizing the futility of standing in the open, it turned sharply. The whites that could still move followed, trudging or stumbling through the broken gate and into the streets beyond. It was not an orderly retreat, but a chaotic withdrawal, leaving behind scores of blackened corpses and curling smoke. A ragged cheer burst from the defenders, though it was coated in coughs and sobs from the fumes. Many sank to their knees, exhausted, grieving for the cost of victory in this one courtyard. Jaime looked around in disbelief. The fighting had subsided here, but the city as a whole still roiled with pockets of undead. He could hear distant clashes, screams, the keening wails of whites. The White Walkers had been forced out of the Red Keep's immediate grounds, but they were far from vanquished. Ambulant men and women dashed about, trying to douse spots where the wildfire threatened to spread uncontrollably. The stench was nearly unbearable, a sickening mix of charred flesh, burnt hair, and acrid smoke. Tyrell's soldiers coughed and spat black phlegm as they organized the wounded, ignoring for the moment that they served a queen many of them hated. A few recognized Jaime Lannister, calling him Kingslayer under their breath, but no one had the energy or desire to fight him now. The dead were the common enemy. Cersei, fighting to regain composure, approached the Tyrell knight with the green plumes, who sat astride a wounded horse near the courtyard's edge. He removed his helm, revealing a sweat-soaked face, younger than she expected, perhaps 20 summers. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead. When he saw the queen, he bowed stiffly in the saddle. "Your Grace," he said, voice strained. "We rode from Bitterbridge when we heard rumors that an army of the dead was marching on the capital. I feared we would be too late." Cersei nodded, swallowing to steady her voice. "I do not know your names, sir, but the crown is indebted to you and your men." She tried to appear regal, though soot clung to her skin, and her gown was torn at the hem. "Have you more knights on the way?" He wiped sweat from his eyes, gaze flicking across the smoldering courtyard. "A small force follows behind us. Foot soldiers, some archers. We are not many, Your Grace. Most of the Reach was ravaged by conflicts and other strife." He spoke delicately, aware that some of that strife came at her hand. "Still, we come to stand against these monsters. If we can hold the day, perhaps we can rally more." She inclined her head. "You have our thanks. Secure your wounded, sir." "Sir Davin Flowers," he supplied, with a hint of embarrassment at his bastardy. "I serve the remnants of House Tyrell." Cersei acknowledged him with an imperious nod. "Sir Davin, gather your men. Jaime will coordinate with you to drive these creatures from the immediate vicinity of the keep." She glanced toward Jaime, who was leaning on a broken pillar, breathing heavily and clutching his injured leg. Qyburn approached him with bandages, fussing about the severity of the wound. Jaime waved him away, refusing to be tended until the threat was contained. The queen turned to the last dregs of her gold cloaks, pointing them to vantage points along the keep's walls. Archers repositioned, scanning the city for signs of the White Walkers regrouping. The hush that settled over the courtyard felt both exhilarating and dreadful. Exhilarating because they had survived one more clash. Dreadful because the city beyond these walls likely remained a battlefield of ice and death. As if to confirm this, a messenger stumbled in from the southwestern gate area, panting heavily. "They've pulled back from the keep, but the Whites roam the streets. Some have holed up in buildings, cornering survivors. The White Walkers themselves. Some say they've gone to the Dragon Pit, others say they're heading for the main thoroughfare to block any approach from outside." His voice quivered with exhaustion. "We can't get a proper count of how many are left. It's chaos." Cersei pressed her lips together. She remembered the unstoppable tide of Whites that had poured through the city the night before. Many must still remain, lurking in squares and alleys. And if the White Walkers were truly regrouping, Dawn alone wouldn't ensure the city's safety. Jaime limped over, half supported by a soldier. His expression was grim. "We need to clear them out street by street, or else we keep losing ground every time the shadows shift." Sir Davin Flowers bowed from his mount. "We'll fight, but how many men remain?" He cast a sweeping glance over the courtyard. At most, a few dozen battered Lannister and City Watch soldiers stood, plus the small contingent of Tyrell knights and footmen who had arrived. Others might be defending pockets of the city, but no one knew for sure. "We cannot be everywhere at once," he murmured, a note of defeat creeping into his tone. Jaime looked skyward, squinting at the brightening sun. "We use the day," he said. "If the White Walkers fear the light, we force them into it, drive them back until they have nowhere to hide. Then we finish them." The words sounded more confident than he felt. He rested a hand on the hilt of his battered sword. "We break into groups. Sweep the area around the keep first. If we can secure a perimeter, we can help pockets of survivors and gather more men." Cersei's face was pinched with tension, but she nodded. "We'll coordinate from here." She gestured to the courtyard, which, though scorched, was still a strategic point. "Qyburn will remain. Dispatch ravens to any outlying banners or fleets that might come. If the city can be saved, we must rally every ally or enemy forced to be our ally." She paused, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "We hold King's Landing for the living." In the remains of the corridor behind them, Tommen stepped forward, swallowing his fear. The boy king wore no crown, his hair disheveled, but his eyes, though damp, shone with a flicker of resolve. "I want to help," he said quietly. "I am the king. My people need to see I haven't abandoned them." He looked around, clearly shaken by the carnage, but determined not to cower. Cersei moved to hush him, But Jaime laid a gentle hand on her arm, shaking his head. For once, perhaps letting Tommen show himself as a symbol might bolster the battered morale of any defenders who caught sight of him alive and unbroken. In fitful shifts, the defenders organized. The Tyrell Knights who could still ride prepared to lead mounted patrols through the nearby streets, chasing straggling whites. Jaime, joined by a cadre of seasoned fighters, would secure the southwestern approach, clearing out the partial breaches that had let the dead pour in. City watchmen fanned out, gathering any refugees or stragglers they found, sending them back to the keep or the sept for relative safety. Archers were stationed on rooftops, scanning for movement. Grim resolve united them, bridging old rivalries. At length, a battered troop of Lannister men from the outer wards limped into the courtyard, describing pockets of heavy fighting deeper in the city. They'd lost half their number but managed to hold a crossroads near the Dragon Pit. The whites were more scattered now, they reported, though still lethal, and at least 2 more White Walkers had been sighted near the pit itself. Some peasants, they added, had attempted to make a run for the harbor, hoping to find ships. They had no word on whether any made it. Cersei's mouth tightened as she listened. She doubted the White Walkers would allow an easy escape by sea, and who knew what shape the harbor was in after the night's chaos. Jaime ordered the newly arrived men to join his sweep of the southwestern gate. As they gathered, a weary hush settled. Morning light fell on the courtyard's charred stones, illuminating a scene of heartbreak. Bodies of men, whites, and even horses lay in scattered piles. The air stank of death and burnt flesh. Smoke drifted lazily from the pockets of still smoldering wildfire. Those who survived coughed and spat, blinking away tears. Cersei noticed a small group of children, orphans now, clinging to one another near an overturned cart. She took a moment to speak softly with them, telling them to go inside the keep and find a man named Qyburn for shelter. Strange times, she thought, when Qyburn became a guardian to frightened children. Yet the city had no better choices left. She then turned to Jaime, who looked more exhausted than ever. "Take care of yourself," she said tersely, though concern shone in her gaze. He nodded, adjusting the improvised bandage that Qyburn had wrapped around his leg. Blood still seeped, but he paid it little mind. "I'll find the White Walkers that remain near the gate," he said. "Make sure they don't get another foothold. Then we'll set up a barrier if we can. Try to keep them pinned in the southern quarters if they're there." He glanced around the blackened courtyard. The old hymn might have made a quip about the madness of fighting ice demons at sunrise, or lamented that he hadn't been born in a simpler era. But there was no room left for flippant remarks. He raised his sword in a final salute to Cersei, then set off with the men at his side. Sir Davin Flowers regrouped with the Tyrell riders, planning to sweep the eastern side, hoping to relieve any survivors pinned in the narrower alleys. The gold rose banner, tattered from the fight, still fluttered in the dawn breeze, marking an unexpected alliance that no one had foreseen. Left in the courtyard, Cersei exhaled and took stock of the remaining defenders who would stay behind to protect Tommen and the keep. Most were bruised, burned, or limping. She forced herself to speak words of encouragement, reminding them that the dawn was in their favor, that the White Walkers had been driven from the heart of the keep. Each word tasted like ash in her mouth. Though the morning sun glowed overhead, the city's future remained precarious. Time blurred as the day advanced. Columns of defenders moved out, forging through rubble-strewn lanes where the footprints of night's horror lingered. Icy residue clung to walls, blackened scorch marks from wildfire seamed the streets, and the stench of death was everywhere. They found small enclaves of survivors cowering in shops or behind barricades. Many had barely slept, too terrified to move in the darkness. They recounted tales of whites tearing neighbors apart, of monstrous shapes with blue eyes stalking the gloom. Some reported that after the White Walkers retreated, the whites had grown aimless, often staggering about as if lost. Yet, in at least one instance, a White Walker had returned to gather them, forging an organized group that rampaged through a cluster of inns. Amid the rubble, groups of defenders fought pockets of undead. Each time, they used the advantage of sunlight, trying to corner the whites in open spaces where archers rained flaming arrows. They lobbed occasional casks of oil or small jars of wildfire, though the main caches had been used at the keep. The day's warmth hindered the White Walkers from unleashing their full fury, and that proved the living's greatest shield. Still, the cost was high. Men died from ambushes or froze under blasts of conjured cold when they cornered a walker in a shaded alley. The creature would lash out before vanishing into shadow, leading them on a deadly chase. Jaime's group spent hours combing the southwestern quarter, forcing Whites into open squares where Tyrell cavalry or Lannister archers could dispatch them. Each confrontation left him more fatigued, his leg throbbing with every step. He longed for a moment's rest, but refused to stop while the undead still stalked the area. The men with him respected this grim resolve, pushing themselves to match his tenacity. They encountered a few Whites wearing the tattered uniforms of the City Watch, an unnerving sight that underscored how swiftly the dead had multiplied. On the eastern side, Sir Davin Flowers led his riders through narrower streets near Flea Bottom. Reports reached them of White Walkers moving among the hillside hovels. The place was a charnel house of half-burned shacks and frost-rimed bodies. The stench was nearly unbearable. Men had to wrap cloth over their noses. As they advanced, they found knots of survivors who cheered weakly at the sight of the Golden Rose, hardly caring it was once a rival banner. More than once, Tyrell men found themselves cut off by a sudden swarm of Whites, forced to hack their way out in an orgy of blood and rotted limbs. And in each sun-dappled alley, they caught fleeting glimpses of tall, pale figures, slipping away from direct confrontation. The White Walkers were cunning, biding their time in corners of the city where the sunlight did not fully penetrate. By midday, word reached the keep that the Northern Gate district was still overrun. Some survivors had fled to the Grand Baelor Sept, but the structure's heavy doors had apparently been compromised. The undead pressed inside, pitting Qyburn's hidden reserves of wildfire against them. Cersei, upon learning this, felt fresh dread coil in her gut. The Sept was one of the last major sanctuaries for refugees. If the White Walkers claimed it, they would have hundreds more victims to transform. She sent out urgent orders for Jaime's group and Davin's cavalry to converge on the Sept if they could manage it. Tommen pleaded to join in the relief, but his Kingsguard insisted he remain at the keep. The boy's frustration was palpable, yet no one dared risk him in a pitched fight. Cersei herself paced the courtyard restlessly, an anxious queen hearing half-formed accounts of battles across the city. Even as the day brightened, her mood darkened. Fragments of her old cunning flared, urging her to consider how she might twist alliances or secure new loyalties. But each time the thought arose, it was drowned by the raw truth that politics had no meaning if the undead devoured them all. In the streets leading to the Sept, Jaime met up with a band of Tyrell foot soldiers, each exhausted from constant skirmishes. Their leader recognized him and gave a curt nod. They formed a combined column, marching over rubble and shattered bodies. The midday sun beat down on them, intensifying the smell of rot. They pressed on, teeth gritted. Then, as they turned a corner, the towering facade of the Grand Baelor Sept came into view, illuminated by the high sun. It was under siege. Whites clustered around a breach in the outer wall, some charred by flames but still crawling forward. In the main plaza, defenders had erected barricades from broken carts and pews taken from inside the Sept. Qyburn's men and a handful of alchemists scurried along the ramparts, flinging jars of burning pitch at the undead. But the Whites kept coming, spurred on by a White Walker that lurked in the shadow cast by the Sept's massive dome. Jaime could see it from across the plaza, a pale figure with a staff-like weapon, eyes glowing like beacons. Battered as they were, Jaime and the Tyrell soldiers didn't hesitate. They charged into the plaza, swords raised, shields forward. Defenders atop the barricade cheered weakly at the sight of reinforcements. Arrows zipped overhead, striking the Whites with limited effect, but enough to disrupt their ranks. The White Walker in the shadows lifted its staff, conjuring a wave of cold that scuttled across the plaza floor. Ice formed in swirling patterns, tripping men and freezing their boots to the ground. Jaime cursed, barely managing to keep upright as the slick surface threatened to topple him. Archers behind him stumbled, letting loose arrows at odd angles. A group of Tyrell men fanned out, attacking from the flank. They tossed jars of lamp oil at the whites, setting them ablaze with quick-thrown torches. Smoke billowed upward. Screams and hisses merged into a chorus of agony. Jaime waded deeper in, slashing methodically. The whites were weaker in direct sunlight, but still they lunged, teeth snapping. One managed to latch onto Jaime's shoulder. He hissed in pain as its frozen fingers clutched for his throat. With effort, he headbutted it, hearing the crack of bone. The white loosened its grip. He shoved it off and stomped on its skull, panting, eyes wild. A hush fell as the White Walker, hidden in the dome's shadow, emerged onto the plaza. Even from across the battered space, Jaime felt the unnatural chill intensify. The creature raised its staff. Frost spirals danced along its length. A line of whites, as if commanded, veered away from the barricade to converge on Jaime's position, forming a living, well, unliving, barrier between him and the walker. Jaime swallowed his dread and advanced, mindful of the slick ground. Men behind him tried to follow, but were quickly embroiled in fights of their own. He squared off against the whites, blades clashing. 3 or 4 attacked in a frenzy, raking at him with nails and snapping jaws. Their combined strength nearly overwhelmed him. Another Tyrell soldier intervened, hacking at their spines. It was enough for Jaime to slash downward, severing limbs. He kicked aside the writhing torsos, chest heaving. Then he glimpsed the White Walker, staff held high, striding closer. Its eyes bored into him, cold fury tangible in the air. Jaime felt his breath catch. He might have stood a chance if he had dragon glass, but they had little of that in King's Landing. Again, he found himself wishing for the black daggers rumored to kill these monsters outright. All he had was battered steel and a tattered shield. In that moment, Qyburn himself appeared atop a fragment of the Sept's collapsed roof, brandishing something that glinted in the sunlight. A large crossbow, reminiscent of the scorpion devices used against dragons. It was a makeshift contraption, and at its tip burned a small wad of green wildfire. Jaime realized the danger at once. If Qyburn's aim was true, the White Walker might be hit. If it missed, the projectile could detonate on the plaza floor, incinerating friend and foe alike. Qyburn's voice, thin with tension, rang across the plaza. "Stand clear!" Jaime flattened himself against a chunk of debris, calling to the men around him to take cover. The White Walker noticed the commotion and spun, staff raised. A swirl of cold air battered Qyburn's perch, nearly knocking him off balance. But he pulled the crossbow's trigger, releasing the bolt with a hiss. The missile streaked across the plaza, trailing a small tail of green flame. The White Walker tried to conjure ice in defense. Frost crackled in the air. But the sunlight that glared down plus the speed of the bolt prevented it from fully diverting the shot. With a crack, the missile punched into the White Walker's side. A split second later, the wildfire ignited. A blinding flash of emerald flame exploded outward, sending shards of ice and steaming gore across the plaza. Jaime shielded his eyes from the brilliance, feeling the heat wash over him in a wave. The White Walker's shriek died in the rush of flame. When the glow subsided, a cloud of steam clung to the spot where the walker had stood. Bits of blackened ice littered the ground. The whites in the immediate vicinity staggered as though unmoored. Some collapsed instantly, as if losing the tether that bound them. Others twitched aimlessly, still functional but lacking clear direction. Qyburn's triumphant gasp was audible from the rooftop. Jaime seized the moment. "Push them back! Finish the rest!" he roared, beckoning the Tyrell soldiers and the Sept defenders forward. They surged across the plaza, hacking down the disorganized whites. Fire arrow volleys rained from the Sept upper windows. Some men jumped over the barricade to join the fight, stomping down the undead that hadn't yet fallen. Within minutes, the last remnants of that pack were reduced to lifeless corpses. A stunned silence followed. Men coughed and wheezed, leaning on their weapons. Qyburn eased himself down from the precarious roof, sweat pouring. He nearly twisted an ankle on a loose block of stone as he landed, but a soldier caught him. The plaza was thick with smoke, but the Sept's doors still stood, albeit warped from internal fighting. Jaime felt a wave of relief. They had prevented a massacre. He forced himself to breathe, ignoring the searing pain in his leg. Qyburn approached, eyes shining with a strange mix of scholarly excitement and horror. "It worked, my lord," he whispered. "Wildfire within a scorpion bolt. A direct hit can kill them." Jaime nodded, though he took no pleasure in the demonstration. The cost had been too high, and wildfire was a fickle friend. Then the heavy doors of the sept creaked open. Dozens of terrified faces peered out. Small folk, wounded soldiers, a handful of septons with singed robes. They gazed upon the battered defenders with a mixture of awe and relief. A wave of sobbing thanks swept through them as they realized the White Walker was gone. Jaime heard calls for water, for bandages, for mercy. The courtyard before the sept was a graveyard, strewn with blackened husks. The stench of death was nearly unbearable. He turned to Qyburn, voice quiet. "Get them inside. See if you can fortify the doors. We'll post guards. The undead might be scattered, but they're not gone." Qyburn nodded, signaling his subordinates to guide the refugees to safer areas in the sept's interior. Jaime took a moment to rest against a pillar, pressing a hand to his leg wound. Blood seeped anew through the bandage. He was dizzy with fatigue, hardly able to think of the next step. All around him, men slumped in relief or wept for lost comrades. The sunlight was warm on his face, as if mocking the horror all around. Another White Walker slain, another fragment of the city reclaimed. But how many more lingered in the labyrinth of King's Landing? How many pockets of white still lurked in cellars or behind broken walls? And beyond the city's limits, an even darker question loomed. Had the others come in force, or was this only the vanguard of a greater invasion? He recalled the old stories of the Long Night, of how the White Walkers once swept across entire kingdoms. The trickle of dread in his stomach told him that even if they saved King's Landing today, the threat might not be over. There could be more. The wall could have fallen, unleashing an unimaginable legion. For now, though, they had secured the septi. Step by step, they were claiming back parts of the city from the undead. The combined strength of Lannister and Tyrell men, plus the scattered surviving banners, might just be enough to hold until nightfall. But Jaime knew that when darkness came again, the advantage would return to the White Walkers. They had to accomplish what they could by day. He pushed himself upright, ignoring the pain, scanning the plaza. The men recognized his authority, turning expectant gazes on him. He nodded wearily. "We press on," he said. "We clear every street we can, we save every survivor. We have to burn the dead so they can't rise again. We keep going until the city is ours once more." His voice gathered resolve with each word, even as exhaustion clung to every syllable. They murmured agreement, battered, but resolute. No one cheered. There was no triumph in this kind of warfare, only grim survival. Together, they would push forward, street by street, alley by alley, a fragile bulwark against an enemy from legend. Smoke drifted around them. The high sun cast stark shadows across the silent bodies. Far in the distance, horns echoed again, uncertain whether they announced new arrivals or another skirmish. With a stiff nod, Jaime gestured for the men to follow. They moved off to continue the fight, leaving the sept behind them for the moment. The glow of midday light bathed the broken city, revealing rooftops collapsed by ice or fire, spires blackened by the night's battles, yet still standing. A testament, perhaps, to the resilience of stone and the tenacity of the living. And so they pressed on, into the uncertain glare of a day that promised no easy victory, but at least a small respite from the endless horror of that first winter night. The White Walkers had come to King's Landing, and the city had not yet died. But for how much longer, none could say.